Throughout the ancient world, traces of lost civilizations still shape the landscape. Massive structures, abandoned cities, and designs whose purpose is not fully understood. These sites are not just remnants of human activity. They reflect decisions, priorities, and knowledge that no longer exist in complete form. Walls stand where their builders are unknown. Foundations remain where entire cultures have disappeared, and spaces persist without clear explanation of how they were used. What survives is only a fraction of what once existed. The rest is missing, erased by time, conflict, or change. The deeper we explore, the clearer it becomes that the ancient world is not fully preserved but partially recovered. Until those missing pieces are found, the past remains an unfinished story. Coastal cities slowly lost the sea, yet refused to collapse. Settlement built on unstable ground still stood for over a millennium, and beneath it all, a water system that should not have worked, yet did. Histria is not just an ancient ruin. It is a contradiction preserved in stone. Founded in the 7th century BCE by settlers from Miletus, Histria became the earliest Greek colony on the western coast of the Black Sea, and when systematic archaeological excavations began in the early 20th century, they revealed a continuous sequence of occupation lasting over 1,000 years, with each layer uncovering fortifications, temples, and hydraulic systems, while at the same time intensifying a central mystery: how a city could survive in environmental conditions that should have made long-term habitation unsustainable. Histria was originally established directly along the Black Sea coastline, but geological evidence shows that sediment carried by the Danube River gradually pushed the shoreline outward over centuries, transforming the coastal landscape so dramatically that today the ruins lie several kilometers inland, separated from open water by lagoon systems. This was not a minor shift, as studies estimate a displacement of approximately 5 to 7 kilometers over 2,000 years, a change that should have effectively destroyed any port-dependent economy. Yet, archaeological findings reveal continued occupation and economic activity long after this transformation, with imported amphorae, coinage, and ceramics still appearing in later layers, suggesting that trade networks remained functional despite the loss of direct maritime access, raising a critical, unresolved question. How did Histria sustain its role in regional exchange without a port? Some theories propose the existence of artificial canals or seasonal navigation routes through the lagoons, but unlike well-documented harbour systems such as those of Alexandria, no large-scale infrastructure has been definitively identified, leaving the mechanism of adaptation largely invisible. The city was constructed on soft, alluvial soil, a substrate highly prone to subsidence and instability, which modern engineering would classify as unsuitable for long-term structural development. Yet despite this, Histria's defensive walls, public buildings, and sacred structures endured for centuries, with excavations revealing layered foundations composed of alternating materials that appear to distribute load and reduce localized stress, a technique that closely resembles modern principles of load dispersion and ground stabilization, even though there is no textual evidence that ancient builders possessed formalized knowledge of such geotechnical methods. In contrast, cities like Pompeii were built on relatively stable volcanic terrain, minimizing the need for complex foundational adaptations, which makes Histria's persistence even more striking, leading to a fundamental question. Was this engineering knowledge developed purely through empirical trial and error, or does it reflect a broader, systematized understanding that has not survived in written form? The most perplexing aspect of Histria lies beneath its surface in its water systems. As the city occupied a transitional zone, where freshwater inflow from inland sources met marine intrusion from the Black Sea, creating fluctuating salinity conditions that would typically contaminate groundwater and render stable freshwater access extremely difficult. In modern hydrogeology, maintaining potable water in such an environment requires detailed knowledge of aquifer dynamics, pressure gradients, and permeability. Yet archaeological evidence shows that Histria achieved precisely this, with excavations uncovering deep wells that consistently yielded fresh water, even in close proximity to saline lagoon systems, some extending several meters below the surface, indicating deliberate targeting of confined aquifers trapped beneath impermeable sediment layers, while additional findings suggest the presence of organized water channels and storage structures, pointing toward planned water management rather than opportunistic use. The contradiction becomes more pronounced when considering that in coastal environments, freshwater typically forms a thin lens floating above denser salt water, a fragile system easily disrupted by over-extraction or environmental change, and according to modern models, sustaining such a lens over long periods requires careful control and understanding of recharge rates. Yet Histria's system appears to have functioned for centuries without clear evidence of advanced filtration or monitoring infrastructure. Comparisons can be made to the Qanat systems of ancient Persia, which demonstrate sophisticated underground water extraction, but those systems operated in more stable geological conditions and are well documented, whereas Histria's environment was far more unpredictable and its methods remain undocumented. The absence of clear filtration systems further deepens the mystery, as there is no definitive evidence of advanced purification technology, raising the question of how salinization was avoided, with possible explanations including precise placement of wells in zones where freshwater pressure exceeded saline intrusion, seasonal regulation of water extraction, or the use of natural geological barriers that were understood intuitively but never formally recorded. Yet all of these remain speculative, because the central paradox persists. The system worked, but the mechanism behind its long-term reliability is still not fully understood. Urban development typically follows a recognizable pattern of gradual evolution, with cities expanding incrementally, adapting infrastructure over time, and refining layouts through successive phases. But at Histria, certain sectors appear to have been constructed with a level of organization that suggests prior planning rather than organic growth, as street grids, drainage systems, and building alignments display coherence and intentionality from relatively early stages, a pattern that contrasts with cities like Miletus, where urban planning became more structured only after extended development, creating an anomaly in which Histria seems to behave as though it was designed with a degree of foresight that would normally require generations of accumulated knowledge, raising the question of whether this reflects an accelerated learning process or the application of pre-existing planning principles that have not been preserved in historical records. Unlike cities that ended abruptly due to catastrophic events such as volcanic eruptions, invasions, or earthquakes, Histria's decline appears to have been gradual, with no definitive destruction layer, no widespread evidence of burning, and no clear signs of violent abandonment, instead showing a slow loss of function over time, likely influenced by environmental changes such as the expansion of lagoon systems and the shifting of trade routes, which reduced the city's strategic importance. However, this leads to a deeper paradox, as a settlement that demonstrated the ability to adapt to unstable ground, shifting coastlines, and complex hydrological conditions ultimately failed to adjust to long-term environmental transformation, raising the unresolved question, why did a system capable of solving immediate and highly complex challenges prove incapable of sustaining itself against gradual, predictable change? Do you think these systems were the result of accumulated experience or traces of a lost knowledge? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Built on a barren limestone ridge above what was once open sea, Enisala Fortress should not exist the way it does. Its walls look crude, its location impractical, and its resources insufficient. Yet it stood for centuries stable, functional, and strategically dominant without leaving behind a clear explanation of how it was engineered to work. Unlike monumental ancient sites rediscovered through dramatic excavations, Enisala was never truly lost. Local populations in the region of northern Dobruja had always known of its presence. However, systematic archaeological attention only began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when researchers started mapping the ruins and attempting to reconstruct its purpose. Initial surveys revealed a fortress dating roughly to the 13th, 14th centuries, possibly linked to the maritime trade networks of Genoa. But even from the earliest measurements, inconsistencies emerged. The structure did not align cleanly with known Genoese construction patterns, nor did it follow standard Byzantine defensive layouts. Instead, it appeared adapted, or perhaps improvised yet paradoxically precise. At first glance, the placement of Enisala seems logical. Elevation provides visibility, and visibility ensures control. From its peak, the fortress commands a sweeping view over the Razm-Sinnoh lagoon system, a body of water that, during the medieval period, connected more directly to the Black Sea. But this apparent advantage hides a deeper contradiction. The hill is geologically composed of compact limestone, offering structural stability but little else. There are no natural freshwater springs on the summit. Soil is thin, unsuitable for agriculture. Wind exposure is high, increasing erosion and reducing long-term habitability. From a logistical standpoint, the site is hostile. Transporting construction material alone would have required immense effort. A single limestone block weighing between 200 and 500 kilograms multiplied across hundreds, possibly thousands of units, implies a coordinated labor force and sustained supply chain. Yet no clear remnants of access roads, ramps, or staging infrastructure have been identified at a scale matching such an operation. Compared to other medieval fortresses such as those built in the Carpathian regions, where forests, water, and transport routes were accessible, Enisala stands out as an anomaly. It is a fortress built where building a fortress makes the least practical sense. At a distance, the walls of Enisala appear unrefined. Stones are irregular in shape, lacking the polished geometry seen in classical Roman or Hellenistic construction. There is no evidence of advanced cutting techniques producing perfectly squared blocks, and mortar, where present, is minimal and inconsistent. Yet structural analysis tells a different story. Despite their irregularity, the stones are fitted with a level of contact precision that minimizes voids, while load distribution appears carefully managed, with larger stones positioned at stress-bearing points and smaller fragments used as stabilizing fillers. This technique, often described as adaptive interlocking, allows irregular materials to achieve surprising mechanical stability. Modern engineering comparisons reveal something striking. In experimental reconstructions of dry stone systems, structural stability increases significantly when contact surfaces exceed approximately 70% coverage between adjacent stones, and visual surveys of Enisala's walls suggest comparable or even higher contact ratios in certain segments. The walls have endured for more than 6 centuries, surviving seismic activity, long-term weathering, and human neglect without catastrophic collapse. This creates a paradox. The builders lacked precision tools capable of machining stone to exact dimensions, yet they achieved a system where imprecision was compensated through placement intelligence. In contrast, Roman fortifications relied heavily on standardized blocks and mortar bonding, reducing the need for micro-adjustments, while Enisala appears to operate on the opposite principle: variability, controlled through human calibration rather than mechanical uniformity. How this consistency was achieved remains unclear. Without laser leveling, without standardized measurement systems, and without written engineering manuals describing the process, the builders maintained alignment, verticality, and load balance across extended wall sections. One possibility is iterative fitting placing, adjusting, removing, and refitting stones until optimal contact was achieved, but this would dramatically increase construction time and labor cost. Another hypothesis suggests the use of simple but effective tools such as plumb lines, tensioned cords, and reference frames, combined with highly trained labor capable of interpreting structural feedback in real time. Still, this does not fully explain the uniformity observed across different sections of the fortress. The deeper question remains: was this a standardized construction method shared across regions, or the result of localized expertise that has since been lost? Enisala's layout indicates more than basic fortification. The positioning of towers and walls creates overlapping fields of vision, allowing surveillance across a wide radius of the surrounding lagoon system. Measured sightlines extend far beyond immediate defensive needs. In clear atmospheric conditions, visibility can reach distances exceeding 20 kilometers, effectively transforming the fortress into a monitoring station rather than a purely defensive structure. This aligns partially with known Genoese practices, where coastal fortifications doubled as trade control points. Yet most Genoese outposts were located directly on navigable coastlines, not inland on elevated ridges separated from immediate maritime access. The implication is unusual. Enisala may have been designed not only to defend territory, but to observe and regulate movement across a dynamic and shifting landscape, where coastlines, waterways, and economic routes were constantly evolving. No fortress can function without water. The minimum daily requirement for a garrison accounting for drinking, cooking, and sanitation would likely exceed several liters per person, meaning that even a modest group of 50 to 100 individuals would require hundreds of liters per day. Yet at Enisala, no confirmed deep wells have been identified within the core structure. No large-scale cistern systems have been definitively documented, and no clear aqueduct or channeling infrastructure connects the fortress to external water sources. This absence is critical. Rainwater collection is a theoretical solution, but it demands storage capacity and seasonal consistency, and without substantial reservoirs, such a system would remain highly vulnerable to drought conditions. This raises a fundamental possibility. Enisala was not designed for permanent occupation. Instead, it may have functioned as a temporary control point, activated during specific periods such as trade seasons, military operations, or surveillance cycles, rather than maintained continuously. Yet this introduces another contradiction. If the structure was only intermittently used, why invest in such durable and labor-intensive construction? Geological and sedimentary studies indicate that the region surrounding Enisala underwent significant transformation over the past several centuries. What was once open marine access gradually became a system of enclosed lagoons due to sediment accumulation carried by the Danube River. This process altered trade routes, reduced navigability, and effectively isolated the fortress from the very network it may have been built to monitor. Yet there is little evidence of architectural adaptation, no expansions, no redesigns, no attempts to reorient the fortress toward emerging routes. It remained fixed, both functionally and structurally, while its environment evolved around it. In your opinion, is Enisala just an ordinary medieval fortress, or a technical system we still don't fully understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The old town of Ghadames did not emerge from a single excavation, nor was it revealed by a dramatic archaeological breakthrough. Instead, it was slowly understood, pieced together through fragmented accounts left by European explorers of the 18th and 19th centuries, who described it as an impossible oasis city. Only in the 20th century did systematic architectural surveys and early thermal studies begin to document what was actually happening inside its walls, revealing a pattern that could be measured rather than merely observed. Field measurements showed temperature differences of up to 10 to 15 degrees Celsius between shaded interiors and the surrounding desert, where surface temperatures could exceed 45 degrees Celsius, a gap too large to be explained by shade alone. What initially appeared to be a conventional Saharan settlement gradually revealed itself as a controlled environmental system, one that seemed disproportionately advanced compared to the simplicity of its materials. From above, Ghadames appears chaotic, a dense cluster of irregular forms without symmetry, alignment, or visible planning logic. Yet when mapped in detail, the layout reveals an extreme density combined with intentional enclosure that defies expectations of organic growth. Streets are not open corridors but covered, compressed, and interconnected pathways that form a continuous, three-dimensional labyrinth, eliminating direct exposure to sunlight across large portions of the city. Unlike Roman urban models such as Timgad, where rigid orthogonal grids prioritize clarity and expansion, or even medieval Islamic Medinas that evolve organically but retain partial openness, Ghadames pushes enclosure to an extreme limit, suggesting that exposure itself was treated as a problem to be solved. This creates a contradiction within conventional urban theory, which assumes irregular layouts are the result of unplanned growth and therefore produce inefficiencies such as dead ends, poor ventilation, and uneven sunlight distribution. Yet in Ghadames, the irregularity appears to enhance environmental performance rather than degrade it. Studies of airflow in dense built environments demonstrate that narrow, enclosed passages reduce wind speed while increasing pressure differentials, allowing controlled air movement instead of turbulent flow. And in Ghadames, this principle is scaled across the entire Medinat, where covered streets filter and slow hot desert winds, stabilizing temperature and preventing sudden heat spikes while maintaining continuous circulation, behavior that aligns more closely with engineered systems than with accidental urban evolution. The most intensively studied component of Ghadames is its network of covered streets, which extend far beyond isolated shaded alleys and instead form a continuous environmental envelope punctuated by carefully positioned openings that regulate both light and airflow. Thermal measurements consistently show that these corridors maintain temperatures significantly lower than exposed desert streets, often by 10 degrees Celsius or more, a difference that cannot be attributed solely to reduced solar radiation, but instead points toward a combined system of shading, ventilation, and material response. In modern engineering, replicating such passive cooling requires detailed simulations involving solar angles, thermal conductivity, and airflow modeling, often using computational fluid dynamics to predict how air will behave in confined geometries. Yet Ghadames achieves comparable results through spatial configuration alone. The placement of openings is particularly revealing, as they are neither decorative nor random but appear at calculated intervals that allow hot air to escape upward while limiting direct solar penetration, generating a slow vertical movement of air that resembles what modern engineers define as the stack effect. Comparable techniques can be observed in Persian windcatcher systems, such as those found in Yazd, where towers capture and redirect airflow into interior spaces. But the crucial difference lies in scale and integration, because while wind catchers operate at the level of individual buildings, Ghadames distributes the same principle across an entire urban fabric, effectively turning the city itself into a single passive cooling device, a level of systemic integration that remains difficult to explain through incremental trial and error alone. The materials used in Ghadames appear deceptively simple, consisting primarily of mud brick, lime plaster, gypsum, and organic fibers, all of which are widely available and commonly used across North Africa and the Middle East. Yet their combined behavior within this Medina suggests a level of control that exceeds ordinary vernacular construction. Walls are often built to substantial thickness, sometimes exceeding 0.5 meter, creating a high thermal mass that absorbs heat slowly during the day and releases it gradually at night, producing a delayed heat transfer effect that stabilizes indoor temperatures despite extreme external fluctuations. While the principle of thermal mass is well understood today and widely applied in energy-efficient architecture, experimental data from adobe structures indicate that achieving optimal thermal lag requires precise calibration of wall thickness, density, and surface treatment, because insufficient thickness allows rapid heat penetration, while excessive thickness leads to heat retention that raises nighttime temperatures. In Ghadames, however, this balance appears consistently maintained across different structures, suggesting that builders were not merely applying known materials but were operating within an optimal range that maximizes performance. Comparisons with other adobe-based settlements, including those found in Morocco, show effective insulation but rarely the same level of systemic consistency, reinforcing the idea that in Ghadames walls, streets, and roofs do not function independently but interact as components of a unified thermal network, a level of integration that resembles engineered systems more than isolated architectural decisions. Ghadames is not only organized horizontally but vertically, forming a layered structure in which different levels perform distinct environmental and social functions, with enclosed lower streets providing shaded circulation, middle levels serving as thermally stable living spaces, and upper rooftops offering exposure to light and air. This vertical zoning creates a natural convection system in which hot air rises from the lower levels and escapes through rooftop openings while cooler air remains trapped below, establishing a passive circulation loop that regulates temperature without mechanical assistance. In modern sustainable architecture, similar effects are achieved through atriums, ventilation shafts, and solar chimneys that require precise calculations of pressure gradients and temperature differences, yet in Ghadames, no such calculations are recorded, even though the system operates with remarkable efficiency. Adding to this complexity is the integration of social structure within the same spatial framework, as historical accounts indicate that rooftops formed a separate circulation network, primarily used by women, effectively creating a dual-layer city where movement patterns align with thermal behavior, suggesting that environmental engineering and social organization were not independent considerations, but were designed as a single interdependent system. The deeper analysis progresses, the more one unresolved issue becomes impossible to ignore, which is the complete absence of a documented framework explaining how Ghadames was designed, as no surviving manuscripts describe its layout, no engineering treatises outline its principles, and no transitional stages demonstrate a gradual evolution from simpler forms. Despite this absence, the city exhibits controlled thermal gradients, integrated airflow systems, material optimization at an urban scale, and spatial organization aligned with environmental forces, all of which typically require formal knowledge systems in other historical contexts. Roman engineering, for example, is documented in the writings of Vitruvius, while Persian hydraulic systems are preserved in detailed records, Yet Ghadames exists without an equivalent body of theory, creating a gap between observable performance and recorded knowledge that remains unexplained. Ghadames does not stand entirely alone, but fits into a broader pattern of ancient constructions that appear more optimized than their technological context would predict. From the precision of Andean stonework to the hydraulic sophistication of the Indus Valley, yet it differs in a critical aspect because it does not address a single engineering challenge, but simultaneously resolves multiple environmental constraints, including extreme heat, intense solar radiation, limited water availability, and sand-laden winds. What makes this particularly significant is that these solutions are not isolated innovations, but are integrated into a unified urban system in which every component contributes to overall performance, suggesting a level of systemic thinking that is rarely attributed to pre-industrial societies. Halmyris is located at the edge of the Danube Delta, a region defined not by stability but by constant transformation. Rivers shift, sediments accumulate, land appears and disappears over decades. It is precisely the kind of environment where permanent architecture is expected to fail, and yet Halmyris did not. The site first entered modern historical awareness in the 19th century through scattered references and surface observations, but systematic excavations only began in the late 20th century. Early surveys identified defensive walls, towers, and traces of Roman military occupation. Later excavations revealed far more: a basilica, a crypt, and stratified occupation layers indicating continuous use from the 1st century CE into the Byzantine period. Each campaign added detail, but also deepened the central contradiction this was not a temporary outpost. It was a long-lived, structurally stable settlement built in one of the least stable environments in southeastern Europe. Initial excavations uncovered the fortification system, stone walls several meters thick, reinforced towers, and carefully designed entry points. Subsequent campaigns revealed a Christian basilica constructed in the 4th century, followed by the discovery of a crypt containing 2 skeletons attributed to the martyrs Epictetus and Astian. Later studies identified evidence of water proximity sediment layers, geomorphological patterns, and structural orientation suggesting that Halmyris once had direct access to navigable waterways. Each discovery expanded the site's function, military, religious, and possibly commercial. But none resolved the fundamental problem. How did it persist here at all? The first and most significant mystery lies in its location. Roman engineering was not random. Across the empire, fortresses were strategically placed based on elevation, defensive advantage, and geological stability. Sites like Vindolanda or the forts along Hadrian's Wall were constructed on firm ground, often elevated, minimizing long-term structural risk. Halmyris violates this pattern completely. It sits within a deltaic environment characterized by alluvial soils, fine-grained sediments with high water content, low cohesion, and a well-documented tendency towards subsidence. Modern geotechnical studies show that such soils can shift measurably within decades. Over centuries, the effect compounds dramatically. To quantify this, deltaic subsidence rates in comparable environments can reach several millimeters per year. Over 500 years, that translates into vertical displacement on the order of 1 to 2 meters, more than enough to destabilize stone foundations. And yet the walls of Halmyris remained intact long enough to support continuous occupation across multiple centuries. There is no surviving documentation describing specialized foundation techniques, no evidence of deep piling systems comparable to later Venetian engineering, and no clear indication of artificial ground stabilization. The archaeological record shows adaptation and repair, but not the kind of foundational innovation required to fully explain such longevity. This creates a structural paradox. Either the Romans employed localized engineering solutions that have left no clear trace, or the environmental conditions during the occupation period were significantly different from those observed today. Paleogeographic studies suggest that the Danube Delta has undergone major shifts over the past 2 millennia, but even reconstructed ancient shorelines do not fully resolve the instability problem. The fortress was still built in a marginal zone, an area where long-term settlement would typically be avoided. What makes this even more unusual is that Roman military planning was typically conservative, favoring predictability over experimentation. Halmyris, by contrast, behaves like an exception that should not exist within that system. The second anomaly concerns the scale and intensity of fortification. Halmyris was not a lightly defended outpost. Its walls, towers, and internal layout indicate a level of military investment comparable to far more strategically critical sites. Yet historically, this region was not the primary axis of major Roman conflicts. Compared to heavily contested frontiers like the Rhine or the main Danube line further west, Halmyris appears overbuilt. Defensive architecture generally reflects threat level. Here, the architecture suggests either a threat that was never recorded or a strategic importance that has been underestimated. The disproportion between location and defensive strength creates a mismatch that remains unresolved. The third layer of complexity emerges with the basilica and the crypt. The transformation of a military site into a religious center is not unusual in late antiquity, but the prominence of the basilica at Halmyris suggests more than routine conversion. The attribution of the remains to Epictetus and Astion is based on later textual traditions rather than direct scientific confirmation. Radiocarbon analysis places the remains within a broadly compatible timeframe, but not with sufficient precision to conclusively verify identity. More importantly, the presence of such a site implies that Halmyris held symbolic or spiritual significance beyond its military function. Why this location, remote, unstable, and marginal, became a focal point for early Christian memory remains unresolved. Another unresolved question involves its relationship to water. Geological and sedimentary evidence indicates that Halmyris was once connected to a navigable branch of the Danube or a nearby lagoon system. If true, this would partially explain its strategic value control over a fluid, shifting water network. However, no intact harbour structures have been definitively identified, and the ancient hydrological configuration remains partly speculative. The delta has reconfigured itself multiple times since antiquity, erasing direct evidence and leaving only indirect traces. This raises the possibility that Halmyris was once far more connected and far more important than its present inland position suggests. Finally, there is the question of abandonment. Many Roman sites show clear signs of violent destruction, economic collapse, or environmental catastrophe. Halmyris does not. The archaeological layers suggest gradual decline rather than sudden collapse. Occupation diminishes, structures fall into disuse, and the site is eventually left behind. There is no single catastrophic event, only a quiet disengagement. This pattern complicates interpretation because it removes the most common explanatory frameworks. Without a clear ending, the site resists being placed into a familiar historical narrative. Taken together, Halmyris does not present a single mystery, but a convergence of them. A fortress built where it should not stand, a structure that persists where it should fail, a defensive system that exceeds apparent necessity, a religious center emerging in an unlikely place, a settlement connected to waterways that no longer exist, and an ending that offers no clear cause. Individually, each of these anomalies might be explained: environmental fluctuation, strategic miscalculation, religious reinterpretation, gradual economic decline. But combined, they form a pattern that resists simple explanation. Halmyris does not contradict Roman engineering. It exposes the limits of what we currently understand about how that engineering was applied in extreme conditions. And that leaves a final question unresolved. If a site like Halmyris could exist, function, and endure for centuries under conditions we consider unsuitable, how many other places have followed the same pattern and simply disappeared without leaving enough evidence behind to challenge our assumptions? Stone should crack here, mortar should fail. Structures built on this exposed plateau, where temperature swings can exceed 40 degrees Celsius between seasons, should not remain coherent for 2 millennia. And yet, at Porolissum, they do, quietly defying the expected limits of Roman engineering. Porolissum was first systematically identified in the 19th century, with early excavations beginning in the late 1800s under Austro-Hungarian administration, and later expanded in the 20th century by Romanian archaeologists who uncovered fortifications, gates, roads, and an amphitheatre, with each excavation phase revealing not a single anomaly, but a repeating pattern of engineering decisions that seemed optimized far beyond what their time should have allowed. Porolissum sits along the northern frontier of the Roman Empire as part of the defensive limes, and unlike iconic urban centres such as Pompeii or the rigid geometric grid of Timgad, it was never built as a showcase city, but instead functioned as a control node, exposed, functional, and vulnerable, which makes the level of engineering integration found here far more difficult to explain, because every component appears to operate not independently, but as part of a unified system. The primary entrance at Porolissum is not aligned along a straight axis, but instead forces entrance through a sequence of angled passages, narrow corridors, and staggered walls, where reconstructed measurements show angular deviations between wall segments of approximately 10 to 15 degrees repeated with remarkable consistency. And in modern crowd dynamics, such geometry is known to reduce movement speed and increase controllability without direct enforcement by creating behavioral friction, as individuals naturally slow when navigating constrained, non-linear paths. What makes this particularly striking is that this effect is typically modeled only in 21st century studies of crowd behavior, yet no surviving Roman text describes such a system in theoretical terms. And although similar ideas appear later in medieval fortifications, with deliberately engineered choke points and controlled zones, Porolissum predates those developments by centuries, raising an unresolved question of whether this design emerged purely from repeated empirical experimentation or reflects an intuitive understanding of flow control principles that would not be formally described mathematically for nearly 2,000 years. The internal road system of Porolissum reveals another layer of complexity, where despite being built on uneven and elevated terrain, gradients are maintained within a narrow range, with archaeological surveys indicating slopes rarely exceeding 8 to 10%, closely matching what modern civil engineering considers optimal for sustained movement. A fact that becomes even more unusual when considering the absence of accurate large-scale topographic mapping tools. While many pathways do not follow straight lines but instead curve with the terrain, while maintaining nearly consistent radii over long distances, implying not only local adaptation but also a form of continuous spatial awareness. And when compared to Pompeii, where streets follow a grid imposed on relatively flat ground, or Timgad, where strict orthogonal planning reflects geometric rigidity, Porolissum behaves as a flexible system that adapts dynamically to its environment, as if guided by a comprehensive terrain model that should not have been possible with second-century surveying capabilities. Surrounding Porolissum is a network of elevated observation points, including hills, towers, and natural ridges integrated into a broader defensive system. And when analysed spatially, these points form overlapping lines of sight where each node maintains direct visual connection with at least two others, with distances falling within effective ranges for signal transmission, likely using fire or smoke, thereby creating redundancy in communication, so that if one point fails, signals can still be transmitted through alternate paths, a principle that mirrors modern network systems where overlapping coverage ensures resilience and fault tolerance. And although the Roman use of signaling systems is well documented, the level of distribution and optimization in this network exceeds minimal functional requirements, suggesting it may not be merely a tactical solution, but an early manifestation of distributed systems thinking that has yet to be fully understood. This is where Porolissum becomes most difficult to explain, because the region experiences significant thermal variation with freezing winters and hot summers, conditions that typically cause stone to expand and contract cyclically, placing stress on structural bonds and generating microfractures that accumulate over time. In most ancient constructions, this leads to visible structural degradation within a few centuries. Yet at Porolissum, many wall segments remain structurally coherent after nearly 2,000 years, and analysis of surviving mortar samples reveals a non-uniform composition with variations in aggregate size, lime ratios, and indications of locally sourced minerals mixed into the material, which at first appears uncontrolled but aligns with a principle recognized in modern materials science, where heterogeneous structures are more effective at distributing stress, interrupting crack propagation pathways, and reducing the likelihood of catastrophic failure, while uneven thermal expansion between components allows energy absorption rather than stress concentration at single nacort, creating a more resilient system than a uniform material. This produces a paradox because standard Roman concrete, such as opus caementicium, was already highly advanced, especially in marine environments, yet the formulation used at Porolissum does not fully match standard recipes, and instead appears deliberately adapted to local environmental conditions. And when compared to structures such as Hadrian's Wall, where similar climatic stress has led to clear long-term deterioration, Porolissum shows segments with significantly higher cohesion, further supported by evidence of stratified foundations in certain areas where alternating material layers may have functioned as primitive shock absorbers against ground movement and freeze-thaw cycles, closely resembling modern geotechnical engineering strategies, despite the complete absence of any surviving documentation explaining these methods, leaving open the question of whether such techniques were the result of prolonged empirical refinement or evidence of a systematic understanding of material behavior and environmental interaction that has since been lost. Individually, each feature of Porolissum can be explained by known Roman engineering, but together the site functions as a coordinated system where gates regulate movement, roads optimize terrain, observation points form a resilient network, and materials adapt to environmental stress, creating an integrated design that appears deliberately calculated, yet without any surviving blueprint, written theory, or clear developmental stages. Porolissum seems to emerge fully formed at the edge of an empire. What if Porolissum is not an isolated anomaly, but evidence of a deeper layer of ancient engineering logic that we are only beginning to recognize? Stone is supposed to resist human intention. It fractures, it erodes, it forces compromise. Yet in the high plateau of northern Spain, there exists a place where stone does the opposite, it obeys. Entire homes, stairways, corridors, and hydraulic systems are not built on the land, but carved into it with a level of control that appears strangely deliberate. At Tiermes, the question is not simply who built it, but how such precision emerged without leaving behind the process that should have created it. Tiermes was known locally for centuries as a ruin embedded in rock, but systematic archaeological study began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with major excavations conducted under Spanish archaeologist Blas Tarracina in the 1920s and 30s. These investigations revealed a settlement with origins traced to the Celtiberians around the 5th century BCE, later expanded under Roman occupation. Excavations uncovered carved residential complexes, a Roman forum, thermal baths, and an extensive network of subterranean structures, all integrated directly into red sandstone bedrock, transforming what initially appeared to be natural erosion into clear evidence of a deliberately engineered urban system. Unlike cities such as Pompeii or Machu Picchu, where materials are assembled layer by layer, Tiermes follows an inverse architectural logic, in which space is created by removing matter rather than adding it. Archaeological mapping demonstrates that large portions of the settlement were carved downward and inward from continuous sandstone formations, a method that requires absolute commitment because every cut is irreversible and every error permanent. Yet within Tiermes, there are no clear signs of large-scale correction, no abandoned chambers, no misaligned corridors, and no evidence of progressive trial and error. Instead, the spatial organization appears intentional from the outset, with residential rooms typically ranging between 8 and 15 square meters and staircases, maintaining consistent riser heights of approximately 15 to 20 centimeters. This level of uniformity implies not only technical capability but also pre-visualization, suggesting that builders possess the ability to mentally construct and plan complex three-dimensional layouts before executing them directly into stone. Sandstone, the dominant geological material at Tiermes, typically measures between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, making it significantly softer than granite and therefore workable with iron tools available during later occupation phases. However, the central issue is not whether the stone could be cut, but how it was cut with such remarkable consistency across large surfaces. Detailed analysis of surviving walls reveals flat planes extending several meters with minimal deviation, parallel tool marks that maintain consistent spacing, and sharply defined internal angles, approaching 90 degrees features that imply controlled repetitive motion rather than irregular manual shaping. Experimental archaeology indicates that achieving such precision manually would require not only extensive labor, but also standardized techniques, including consistent tool angles, force application, and measurement systems maintained across time. When compared to Petra, where Nabatean rock-cut architecture visibly preserves irregularities, asymmetries, and layered carving stages, Tiermes appears unusually restrained and uniform, suggesting a different operational approach. Even more striking are the staircases, where measurements across multiple excavation zones reveal variations in step height, often remaining within less than 1 centimeter, a tolerance level that implies either a formalized measurement system or an exceptionally disciplined transmission of craftsmanship across generations. Yet no written documentation survives to describe such systems among the Celtiberians, and although Roman engineering could theoretically account for refinement, stratigraphic evidence confirms that some of the most precise carvings predate full Roman integration, creating a persistent gap between expected technological capability and the physical evidence preserved in stone. Beneath the visible structures of Tiermes lies a secondary system composed of channels, reservoirs, and conduits carved directly into the bedrock, forming a network that appears neither random nor purely opportunistic. Gradient analysis conducted on preserved water channels demonstrates slopes calibrated with notable consistency, allowing water to flow efficiently without stagnation or destructive erosion. with some inclines maintained steadily across distances exceeding 20 meters. Such precision suggests an applied understanding of fluid behavior, not in abstract theoretical terms, but through repeatable and controlled engineering practice. Comparable hydraulic strategies are documented at Petra, where water collection and distribution systems were essential for survival in arid conditions. Yet Tiermes presents a more enigmatic case because it exists in a region where water resources are limited and less predictably available. This creates a paradox. The infrastructure reflects a level of planning appropriate for sustained habitation, yet the surrounding environment does not clearly justify such investment, raising the possibility that Tiermes functioned within a broader, now lost system of resource management or regional interaction. Tiermes occupies an elevated plateau within the modern province of Soria, characterized by a dry climate, seasonal temperature extremes, and relatively poor agricultural conditions. From a conventional economic or settlement perspective, such a location would not be considered optimal for supporting a large and stable population. Nevertheless, archaeological estimates suggest that during its peak, Tiermes may have sustained anywhere from several hundred to over 1,000 inhabitants, implying the existence of reliable strategies for water management, food acquisition, and long-term habitation. The carved nature of its architecture may have provided passive thermal regulation, with interior spaces maintaining more stable temperatures than the external environment, representing a sophisticated adaptation to climatic stress. However, what remains difficult to reconcile is the apparent completeness of this adaptation, as there is little evidence of gradual development or incremental improvement, suggesting instead that these solutions appeared already refined at the time they were implemented. In contrast to sites such as Pompeii, where sudden catastrophic events preserved a clear narrative of destruction, Tiermes offers no equivalent archaeological signature of abrupt collapse. There are no extensive burn layers, no widespread structural failures, and no mass burial evidence that would indicate a singular crisis event. Instead, the material record points toward a gradual process of depopulation, with artifacts becoming increasingly scarce and signs of maintenance diminishing over time until the settlement was ultimately abandoned. This absence of a defined endpoint complicates interpretation, as it removes the possibility of attributing the city's disappearance to a single identifiable cause, leaving open multiple possibilities ranging from economic shifts to environmental pressures or broader socio-political changes. If a city can exist with this level of precision, yet leave behind no trace of how it was created, what do you think we are missing in our understanding of ancient technology? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Discovery came quietly. Unlike buried cities revealed by chance or catastrophe, Ulaca was never truly hidden. It was simply ignored. Rising across a granite plateau in central Spain, the site was first systematically documented in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when Spanish archaeologists began mapping Iron Age hill forts across the region of Avila. What they found did not fit expectations. Instead of a modest fortified village, Ulaca extended across nearly 70 hectares, placing it among the largest known Vettonian settlements in the Iberian Peninsula. Early surveys noted massive defensive walls stretching over 3 kilometers, carved features embedded directly into bedrock, and an absence of architectural hierarchy that would typically define a city of this scale. It was not just large, it was structurally inconsistent with what a pre-Roman society was supposed to build. Excavations that followed were limited but revealing. Initial campaigns in the early 20th century uncovered domestic zones, stone foundations suggesting clustered habitation, though without uniform planning. Mid-century investigations identified sections of fortification, confirming the use of large granite blocks assembled without mortar, relying instead on weight, friction, and geometric placement. Later archaeological work, particularly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, focused on specific anomalies. A monumental staircase carved directly into granite bedrock, and a massive sculpted stone structure interpreted as a ritual altar. Each phase of excavation added fragments of understanding but never a complete system. No inscriptions clarified ownership. No tools were found that matched the scale of construction. No clear administrative center emerged. The more Ulaca was studied, the less it resembled a conventional ancient settlement. The first major contradiction begins with its location. Positioned at an elevation approaching 1,500 meters, Ulaca exists in an environment defined by exposure, strong winds, seasonal cold, and limited access to stable water sources. For comparison, contemporaneous settlements such as Numantia occupied defensible yet resource-accessible terrain, integrating proximity to rivers and agricultural land. Coastal hill forts like Castro de Baroña leveraged marine resources and moderate climates. Ulaca does neither. Its plateau offers visibility, but at the cost of sustainability. And yet, evidence suggests occupation spanning multiple generations between the 4th and 1st centuries BCE. A settlement of this size, under these conditions, should not persist unless its purpose extended beyond simple habitation. The second contradiction is physical. The stone. Across Ulaca, granite dominates not as scattered debris, but as structured architecture. Granite, with a compressive strength exceeding 100 megapascals, is notoriously resistant to shaping. Even with iron tools, quarrying and refining such material demands significant labor investment and technical coordination. Yet at Ulaca, large blocks, many estimated to weigh several tons, are positioned with relative precision. Walls maintain alignment without mortar. Surfaces show signs of deliberate shaping, though without the regular tool marks typically associated with advanced metal implements. More striking still is the integration between natural bedrock and constructed form. Instead of fully extracting and relocating material, builders appear to have modified the landscape in place, carving directly into granite to produce functional structures. Nowhere is this more evident than in the staircase. Carved into a solid outcrop, the steps ascend toward a flattened upper platform. Each tread is uneven, but intentionally so, suggesting adaptation to natural contours rather than imposition of a rigid design. The act of cutting into granite at this scale implies repeated, controlled impact over extended periods. Experimental archaeology suggests that shaping even a single cubic meter of granite using basic iron tools can require dozens of labor hours. At Ulaca, the volume of modified stone extends far beyond isolated features. It represents a sustained effort, organized, purposeful, and technically consistent. And yet, no concentration of tools has been recovered to support such activity. No workshops. No debris fields typical of large-scale quarrying. The evidence of work exists. The evidence of the workers' methods does not. Comparative analysis deepens the anomaly. In Mediterranean contexts, large-scale stone construction such as that seen in Greek or later Roman architecture relies on standardized block production, visible chisel patterns, and clear quarry sites. Even in earlier megalithic traditions, transport and placement often leave identifiable traces: ramps, tool fragments, or partially worked stone. Ulaca diverges. Its construction is less about imposing geometry onto material and more about negotiating with it. This has led some researchers to propose that the builders employed hybrid techniques combining limited metal tooling with controlled fracturing thermal stress, or even the strategic use of natural fissures within the granite. None of these hypotheses, however, fully account for the consistency observed across the site. Beyond the stone itself lies the question of function. Among the most discussed features at Ulaca is the so-called altar, a large sculpted granite block positioned at an elevated point within the settlement. Its form is ambiguous, stepped, smoothed in sections, and oriented toward open space. Traditional interpretation assigns it a ritual role, possibly linked to Vettonian religious practices. Yet direct evidence, such as remains of offerings or repeated burn layers, is minimal. The structure's placement, however, is deliberate. From its position, large portions of the surrounding landscape are visible, including distant horizons. This has led to alternative interpretations suggesting observational or calendrical functions. While speculative, such theories highlight a broader pattern at Ulaca: structures that appear functional but resist singular classification. The issue of water intensifies the mystery. No permanent rivers or springs are present on the plateau. Archaeological surveys have identified carved basins and depressions that may have served as reservoirs, capturing seasonal rainfall. But basic hydrological estimates indicate that rainfall alone would struggle to sustain a large, permanent population, especially during dry periods. If Ulaca supported thousands of inhabitants, as its size might suggest, then either its population fluctuated significantly or additional water management strategies existed. Some researchers have proposed the possibility of now lost channels or transport systems linking the plateau to lower elevations. Others argue that the site functioned as a seasonal aggregation center rather than a continuous settlement. Neither explanation is fully supported by current evidence. Social structure presents yet another divergence. Across Ulaca, no clear central authority is visible in the archaeological record. There is no dominant structure, no palace, no administrative complex. Instead, habitation appears distributed clusters of similar-scale dwellings without obvious hierarchy. In contrast, many ancient urban systems, even at early stages, exhibit some degree of centralization, whether political, religious, or economic. Ulaca's layout suggests a different model, a network, rather than a core. This raises the possibility that the Vettones, or at least the community occupying Ulaca, operated under a decentralized system, one capable of organizing large-scale construction without concentrated power. And then, the ending. By the 1st century BCE, Ulaca is abandoned. There are no widespread burn layers indicating destruction, no mass graves, no abrupt structural collapse. The site appears to have been vacated in an orderly manner. This timing coincides with the expansion of the Roman Empire into the Iberian Peninsula, a process that restructured settlement patterns, drawing populations toward more accessible, economically integrated regions. It is possible that Ulaca's inhabitants relocated, adapting to a new system. But if so, they left behind a site that had required immense effort to construct, without dismantling, without repurposing, without clear transition. Do you think Ulaca was a failed experiment left behind, or evidence of a system we still don't fully understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. History usually moves forward. It builds, peaks, declines, and disappears, leaving behind a clear direction like a line drawn across time. But there are places where that line does not behave as expected, places where it fractures, bends back on itself and repeats. Dinagetia is one of those places, not because of a single extraordinary event, but because of something far more unsettling. It was never meant to be a one-time city. It was returned to, again and again, across centuries, by completely different civilizations that should have had no reason to follow the same choice so precisely. On the edge of the Danube, where the river slows and widens before pushing toward the Black Sea, the remains of Dinagetia sit quietly, almost unremarkable at first glance. Low stone walls, broken foundations, scattered outlines of buildings that no longer exist. Nothing about it suggests inevitability. Nothing about it appears unique enough to explain why it mattered. And yet, this exact point on the map was chosen, abandoned, rediscovered, and rebuilt multiple times, first by local Dacian communities, then by the expanding power of the Roman Empire, and later by Byzantine forces trying to hold together what remained of a fractured frontier. The pattern begins before the Romans ever arrived. Early fortifications appeared here not as a grand city, but as a functional outpost, something placed with intent rather than ambition. Then Rome came, and instead of selecting a new optimized location, they reinforced what was already there. Stone replaced earth, geometry replaced improvisation, but the position itself remained unchanged, as if the decision had already been made long before Roman engineers imposed their order onto it. When the empire weakened and external pressures intensified, Dinagetia was struck, damaged, partially erased. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the end. History tends to abandon what fails. But not here. Instead of fading into obscurity, Dinagetia reappears. Not immediately, not continuously, but persistently. The Byzantines return to the same ground, not to create something entirely new, but to reconstruct what had already been lost. Walls are repaired, not redesigned. Foundations are reused, not relocated. The city does not evolve in a straight line. It accumulates. Each phase of construction sits on top of the previous one, like layers of memory that were never fully erased. The result is not a single coherent structure, but a stack of intentions separated by time yet bound to the same coordinates. This is where the anomaly begins to take shape, because Dinagetia is not located at the most defensible position along the Danube. It is not the highest elevation, nor the most inaccessible terrain. It does not dominate the landscape in the way other long-lived fortresses do. In purely strategic terms, it is good but not exceptional. And yet, across centuries of conflict, migration, and technological change, it is consistently selected as if it were indispensable. That consistency becomes harder to explain the more closely it is examined. Civilizations that did not share continuity of governance, culture, or long-term planning all converged on the same decision. They did not inherit a thriving metropolis that forced their hand. More often than not, what they found was ruin, broken walls, collapsed structures, evidence of failure, and still they chose to build again. The architecture itself reflects this unusual relationship with time. There is no clear final version of Dinagetia, no moment where it reaches a definitive form. Instead, it exists as overlapping fragments. Roman precision embedded within earlier layouts. Byzantine repairs cutting through older geometries. Lines that should align but do not, because they belong to different centuries. It is not a city that was designed once and perfected over time. It is a place that was repeatedly resumed. Even more striking is what does not happen here. For a location occupied across such a long span, there is no dramatic technological leap tied specifically to Dinagetia. No revolutionary urban planning that spreads outward. No identifiable phase where it transforms into a dominant regional power. It persists without ascending. It survives without redefining itself. In most cases, longevity and innovation are linked places that last tend to evolve. Dinagetia resists that pattern. It remains functionally similar across its many lives, as if its purpose never required reinvention. That raises a question that cuts deeper than strategy. Because if Dinagetia was simply useful, it would have been replaced when better options emerged. If it were merely convenient, it would not have been rebuilt after repeated destruction. The cost of reconstruction labor, materials, time suggests that returning here was not the easiest choice. It was the necessary one. There is something else embedded in its geography, something less obvious than elevation or visibility. The Danube at this point is not just a river, it is a corridor, a threshold between regions, a moving boundary that defines access and control. Dinagetia does not dominate the river. It sits at a point where movement can be observed, influenced, perhaps constrained in subtle ways. Not the strongest position, but a precise one. A place that does not announce its importance but enforces it through consequence. Over time, this creates a kind of gravitational pull in history. Not a physical force, but a strategic inevitability. When power shifts, when borders move, when old systems collapse, decisions are made under pressure. And under that pressure, different civilizations separated by language and centuries arrive at the same conclusion. This point cannot be ignored. What makes Dinagetia unsettling is not any single mystery, but the repetition itself. One cycle of destruction and rebuilding can be explained. Two might be coincidence. But over centuries, the pattern becomes too consistent to dismiss as chance. It begins to look less like independent decisions and more like convergence, multiple paths leading back to the same fixed point. And yet, the site never fully transforms into something greater than the sum of its parts. It does not become a capital. It does not anchor an empire. It remains, in a sense, incomplete, as if its role was never to dominate, but to endure, to exist at a threshold where presence mattered more than progress. Perhaps that is the key to understanding it. Dinagetia was not important because it grew into something extraordinary. It was important because it could not be left behind. Every time it was destroyed, the absence it created was felt immediately. A gap in control, a vulnerability in movement, a silence where there should have been structure. And so, it was rebuilt not out of ambition, but out of necessity. History tends to celebrate what advances, the cities that expand, the empires that innovate, the structures that redefine what is possible. But Dinagetia belongs to a different category. It is a place defined not by what it became, but by how often it returned. A location where time does not move cleanly forward, but circles back, again and again, insisting on continuity even in the face of collapse. And that leaves a final question, one that lingers long after the ruins themselves have been understood. If a place continues to be rebuilt for over 1,000 years, across civilizations that had every opportunity to choose differently, is it truly a matter of strategy? Or is it something deeper, something embedded in the landscape itself, that we still do not fully understand? On the shifting edge of the Danube, near modern Ulaca, a Roman fortress once rose on ground that behaves less like land and more like a slow-moving system. Fine sediments, seasonal flooding, lateral river migration — this is not where long-term military infrastructure is supposed to survive. And yet, for centuries, Noviodunum did not just exist. It held. What makes Noviodunum unusual is not its identity as a Roman stronghold, but the quiet contradiction embedded in its foundation. Because everything we understand about ancient engineering suggests that structures of this scale, defensive walls several meters thick, harbour installations, storage complexes, require predictability beneath them. Stability, resistance. The Danube floodplain offers none of these. And that is where the anomaly begins. Geologically, the lower Danube basin is composed largely of alluvial deposits, layers of sand, silt, and clay laid down over thousands of years. These materials compress under load, shift with water saturation, and erode under lateral flow. Modern civil engineering treats such environments as high-risk zones. Large constructions require deep piling, soil stabilization, or relocation to firmer ground. Roman engineers were not unaware of this. In places like Colosseum or Pont du Gard, foundations were carefully adapted to terrain, often using layered stone, pozzolanic concrete, and drainage systems to control moisture and load distribution. Even riverine constructions, such as bridges along the Rhine, were anchored into more stable substrates. But at Noviodunum, the archaeological record suggests something different. Excavations indicate that massive defensive walls, likely exceeding 2 to 3 meters in thickness, were erected directly on floodplain soil. No clear evidence of deep foundational pilings has been consistently identified. No extensive substructures comparable to those used in other Roman sites appear in the surviving data. And yet, structural collapse does not dominate the site's history. This raises a contradiction. If the soil behaves as expected, the fortress should have experienced progressive subsidence, cracking, and eventual structural failure within decades, perhaps a century at most. Instead, Noviodunum remained operational from at least the 1st century CE into the Byzantine period, spanning several hundred years. One possible explanation is that the Romans employed ground preparation techniques that are either not preserved or not yet recognized. Compacted gravel layers, timber mats, or drainage channels could have redistributed load and reduced water retention. However, the scale required to stabilize an entire fortress of this size would have been immense, and the archaeological footprint of such interventions remains incomplete. Another possibility is more unsettling, that the environmental conditions of the Danube at the time of construction were significantly different. River channels migrate over centuries. Sediment deposition patterns shift. What is unstable today may have been relatively firm in the past. Yet paleo-environmental reconstructions suggest that while local variations existed, the broader floodplain dynamics were already active during the Roman era. So the question remains unresolved. Not how the fortress was built, but how it endured. Most long-lived settlements tell a story of gradual adaptation. Materials improve, techniques evolve, repairs become visible as distinct phases. At sites like Pompeii, stratigraphy reveals a clear sequence, each layer reflecting a step in technological or cultural change. Noviodunum complicates this expectation. Here, layers exist, but the transitions between them do not always follow a linear progression. In some sectors, finely cut stonework appears abruptly, adjacent to more irregular masonry. Certain walls exhibit construction precision that aligns with advanced Roman techniques, while nearby structures suggest more expedient or localized methods. The inconsistency is not total, but it is persistent enough to disrupt the assumption of continuous development. This opens multiple interpretations. The site may have hosted different construction teams with varying levels of expertise. Periods of rapid rebuilding, perhaps after damage or strategic shifts, could have introduced abrupt changes in quality. Alternatively, materials may have been reused, creating a patchwork of styles that masks an underlying continuity. Yet even these explanations do not fully resolve the pattern, because the distribution of these variations does not always align neatly with known historical phases. It is as if the technological narrative of the site has been partially erased, leaving behind fragments that no longer connect in a straightforward way. Noviodunum was more than a fortress. It functioned as a naval base for the Roman fleet on the Danube, the Classis Flavia Moesica. This implies the presence of docking facilities, storage areas, and access points designed for repeated use. However, When modern researchers examine the relationship between the site and the river, inconsistencies emerge. Some structures associated with the harbour appear positioned in zones where current flow is strong, increasing the difficulty of stable docking. Other areas that would be more suitable for anchorage show less architectural investment. Additionally, geomorphological studies indicate that the Danube's course in this region has shifted over time, altering the relationship between land and water. This leads to a critical uncertainty. Were these structures optimally placed at the time of construction, only to be rendered impractical by later environmental change? Or were they designed according to criteria that differ from our assumptions about Roman naval logistics? Comparisons with other river ports, such as those along the Rhine or in the eastern provinces, generally show alignment between infrastructure and hydrodynamic conditions. Noviodunum does not always conform to this pattern, and without a precise reconstruction of the ancient river channel, the original logic of the harbour remains partially obscured. Many Roman fortresses end with clarity. Destruction layers, burn marks, weapon deposits, evidence of conflict that explains their abandonment. Others decline gradually but leave textual or material records that trace their final phases. Noviodunum offers neither in a complete form. Its occupation extends into the Byzantine period, suggesting continued strategic relevance. Yet at some point, activity diminishes, and the site fades from prominence. There is no single catastrophic layer that marks its end. No definitive record of conquest or deliberate destruction tied directly to its final abandonment. Instead, it appears to have been left behind. This is particularly difficult to reconcile with its location. Positioned along a major artery of movement and trade, controlling access along the Danube frontier, Noviodunum should have retained value. Even if damaged, such a site would typically be repaired, repurposed, or replaced, unless the conditions that made it valuable changed in ways that are not fully captured in the surviving record. What makes Noviodunum unusual is not a single mystery, but the accumulation of mismatches. A fortress built on unstable ground yet enduring for centuries, structural layers without a clear progression, a harbour that does not fully align with its environment, and an ending with no definitive explanation. More importantly, the data surrounding it is incomplete. Compared to similar Roman sites, Noviodunum lacks sufficient records to fully explain how it was built or operated. As a result, it exists in a state between known and understood. Not an impossible technology, but a case where the frameworks we use to interpret history begin to diverge. Each piece makes sense on its own, yet the full picture remains unresolved. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery, not that it cannot be explained, but that it almost fits and then doesn't. So what do you think? Was Noviodunum simply misunderstood? Or are we missing a piece of history that was never recorded? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Cium does not announce itself like a lost city buried in jungle or sand. It was never truly lost. Located on the banks of the Danube in modern-day Romania, near Hrušova, the site has been known since antiquity, referenced in Roman military records and later Byzantine sources. Systematic archaeological investigations began in the 19th century, intensifying through the 20th, revealing layer after layer of fortifications, reconstructions, and structural anomalies. What initially appeared to be a standard Roman castra, a frontier military installation, gradually transformed into something far less straightforward. A site where engineering decisions do not consistently align with known Roman construction logic. At first glance, Cium fits within a well-documented system. Roman castra followed relatively standardized layouts, rectangular plans, orthogonal streets, modular construction, and carefully selected terrain. Yet Cassium diverges from these expectations in subtle but persistent ways, not dramatically enough to be dismissed as an anomaly, yet not consistent enough to be explained as standard variation. The fortress occupies a promontory directly above the Danube, offering clear military advantages, visibility, control of river traffic, and defensive elevation. However, geomorphological studies of the region indicate that this section of the Danube has historically been subject to strong lateral erosion, with riverbank retreat rates in comparable sections of the lower Danube estimated at several tens of centimeters per year under certain hydrological conditions. Over centuries, this would result in measurable instability, and archaeological surveys at Cassium confirm differential settling in foundation layers, evidence of wall displacement and microfracturing, and repeated reinforcement along the same vulnerable edges. In most Roman engineering practice, such conditions would trigger relocation or large-scale terrain modification, as seen in other forts along the Danube, where repositioning occurred once environmental instability exceeded manageable thresholds. Cassium was not relocated. Instead, it was rebuilt again and again on the same unstable ground, suggesting either that its strategic value outweighed the engineering risk to an unusual degree, or that its builders possessed stabilization methods no longer clearly identifiable in the archaeological record. Excavations reveal multiple occupational phases spanning from the early Roman Empire through Byzantine control and into the medieval period, and typically, such stratigraphy reflects a clear technological trajectory, improvements in mortar composition, stone cutting precision, and structural organization. At Cassium, however, that trajectory appears disrupted, as certain early phases exhibit finely cut stone blocks with tight joint tolerances comparable to high-quality Roman masonry elsewhere, while later reconstructions sometimes incorporate irregular stones, reused materials, and less consistent bonding techniques. In some sections, wall thickness and alignment shift without adhering to previous structural logic, creating a pattern that contradicts the expected curve of technological evolution. Instead of steady refinement, the site shows fluctuation, as if construction knowledge was intermittently lost, adapted, or constrained by factors not fully understood. For comparison, sites such as Vindolanda in Britain demonstrate clear sequential improvement, with later phases building upon earlier engineering knowledge, a pattern that Cassium does not consistently follow. One of the most striking features of Cassium is its masonry, where rather than uniform construction, many walls display a hybrid technique combining large stone blocks with smaller rubble infill, inserting brick fragments irregularly within stone courses, and layering rapid repair phases over earlier, more formal construction. From a classical engineering perspective, this appears suboptimal, as Roman military architecture is often associated with precision and standardization. Yet despite this apparent inconsistency, Cassium's walls endured prolonged environmental stress from river erosion, repeated military assaults across centuries, and long periods of partial abandonment. The paradox is clear. A structure that appears technically inconsistent demonstrates unexpected resilience. Modern structural analysis offers a possible explanation, as mixed material walls can dissipate stress more effectively under certain conditions, particularly where ground movement is irregular, and the variability in material composition may have allowed Cassium's fortifications to absorb and redistribute mechanical stress rather than resisting it rigidly. If intentional, this suggests a form of adaptive engineering focused less on perfection and more on survival. Roman engineering is synonymous with large-scale water systems such as aqueducts, cisterns, and drainage networks. Yet at Cassium, no major aqueduct structure has been identified despite the fortress's proximity to the Danube. This presents a contradiction, because while the river provides abundant water, It is not necessarily usable due to seasonal flooding, sediment load, and biological contamination that would have made direct consumption unreliable. Archaeological findings indicate small-scale channels and pits possibly used for water collection, subsurface features that may have functioned as filtration zones, and a lack of large centralized distribution systems, implying a decentralized approach to water management. Instead of transporting water over distance, the inhabitants may have relied on localized filtration and storage, adapting to immediate environmental conditions. Comparable strategies are rare in Roman military contexts, where standardization was typically preferred, yet in frontier zones with unpredictable variables such deviations may have been necessary, leaving open the question of whether these systems were more sophisticated than they appear, or whether key components have simply not survived. Historical records and archaeological evidence confirm that Cium was repeatedly attacked and damaged by Goths, later by various migrating groups, and during the shifting control of the Byzantine Empire. In many cases, such repeated destruction leads to abandonment, with sites being relocated or losing their strategic relevance. Yet Cium defies this pattern as it is rebuilt after major destructive events, remains occupied or reoccupied across multiple political transitions, and maintains its core position rather than being replaced. This persistence suggests that Cium held a significance beyond simple fortification, because while its location on the Danube was important, it was not uniquely so, and other forts along the same frontier were abandoned under similar pressures. One possibility is that Cium functioned as a critical node within a broader defensive network where its specific position, topographical, hydrological, or logistical, could not be easily replicated, while another is that its adaptive construction methods made it uniquely resilient, justifying repeated investment over centuries. Cium does not present itself as a marvel, lacking the monumental scale of Rome's grandest constructions, the precision of iconic stonework, or the visual clarity of a perfectly preserved fortress. Yet it presents a series of contradictions that challenge conventional assumptions. A fortress built on unstable ground yet never relocated, a structure rebuilt across centuries without clear technological progression, walls constructed with apparent inconsistency yet capable of enduring extreme conditions, and a water system that avoids monumental engineering yet sustains long-term occupation, all point toward a deeper anomaly. Cium challenges the idea that ancient engineering progressed in a linear, optimized path toward efficiency and perfection, instead suggesting a system shaped by continuous adaptation to environment, conflict, and uncertainty. In that adaptation lies the deeper mystery, because what Cium ultimately reveals is not what ancient engineers could achieve at their peak, but what they could sustain repeatedly under conditions that should have forced failure. What do you think? Was Cium simply a resilient frontier fortress shaped by necessity? Or does it point to a deeper, less understood approach to engineering in the ancient world? Civilizations collapse in patterns. Systems fail, trade disappears, knowledge fragments. Yet in the aftermath of the Late Bronze Age collapse, when the Mycenaean world disintegrated around 1200 BCE, one small settlement on the island of Euboea did not follow the script. Lefkandi did not simply survive. It operated with a level of structural planning, material understanding, and long-distance connectivity that should not have been possible in a so-called Dark Age. Systematic excavations at Lefkandi began in the 1960s, led by archaeologists including Mervyn Popham and Nicholas Coldstream. What initially appeared to be a modest settlement quickly revealed stratified occupation layers, spanning the transition from the Late Bronze Age into the Early Iron Age. The defining moment came with the excavation of the Tumba Cemetery, where an unusually large structure later termed the Haroun was uncovered. its scale, burial contents, and construction method immediately contradicting the prevailing model of cultural decline in post-Mycenaean Greece. The Tumba building measures approximately 50 meters in length and 10 meters in width, a scale that far exceeds most domestic structures in early Iron Age Greece, which rarely surpass 10 to 15 meters. Even Mycenaean megarons, such as those at Mycenae, while monumental, were constructed in stone and tied to centralized palace economies. At Lefkandi, however, the structure was built primarily from perishable materials, timber posts, mud brick walls, and a thatched roof. Yet its layout reveals a level of architectural planning defined by evenly spaced load-bearing columns, symmetrical organization along an elongated axis, and curved apsidal ends that require controlled geometric execution. From an engineering perspective, maintaining structural stability over a 50-meter span using timber and mud brick demands an understanding of weight distribution and lateral forces, and modern reconstructions suggest that post-placement would need to remain within tolerances of only a few centimeters to prevent progressive failure. The paradox is immediate. During the Greek Dark Age, literacy disappears, monumental stone construction declines, and regional connectivity fragments. Yet, no evidence exists of iterative architectural development leading to this structure. No prototypes, no transitional forms, only a design that appears fully realized. Euboea presents a coastal Mediterranean environment marked by seasonal humidity, salt exposure, and localized soil instability, conditions under which mud brick structures typically degrade within decades without continuous maintenance, while untreated timber is highly susceptible to rot and biological damage. Yet the archaeological footprint of the Tomba structure remains sufficiently intact to allow full reconstruction of its ground plan, with evenly spaced post holes, coherent wall lines, and subsidence patterns that indicate controlled structural decay rather than chaotic collapse. This suggests that the builders possessed a working understanding of soil compaction for stable foundations, selective use of timber species with higher resistance to decay, and drainage strategies that prevented water accumulation at structural bases. Comparable mud brick settlements in the Near East, such as Çatalhöyük, required constant rebuilding cycles to maintain structural integrity, whereas at Lefkandi, the building appears to have remained functional long enough to serve a ceremonial role before its intentional burial, raising a deeper question. Not whether such technical knowledge existed, but why it appears here without any visible transmission pathway or developmental lineage. Inside the Tomba structure, archaeologists uncovered a burial assemblage that merges multiple ritual traditions into a single, highly coordinated event. A male individual cremated and placed within a bronze amphora imported from Cyprus. A female individual buried intact and adorned with intricate gold jewelry, and the remains of 4 horses carefully arranged and sacrificed nearby. Each element carries distinct cultural implications, cremation becoming dominant in later Greek practice, but remaining rare in earlier Mycenaean elite contexts, inhumation reflecting older traditions, and horse sacrifice representing elite status yet requiring substantial economic resources. Maintaining and sacrificing horses in the early Iron Age implies access to grazing systems, breeding knowledge, and organized labor, while the presence of a Cypriot bronze vessel demonstrates ongoing trade connections across the eastern Mediterranean, spanning distances of several hundred kilometers. In contrast, most contemporaneous sites across mainland Greece show reduced material complexity, limited imports, and simplified burial customs. Lefkandi does not conform to this pattern. Instead, it integrates multiple cultural systems into a unified ritual framework, suggesting deliberate synthesis rather than cultural fragmentation. The late Bronze Age collapse disrupted major trade systems linking the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant, with archaeological evidence from sites such as Ugarit indicating sudden destruction around 1200 BCE and the disappearance of administrative systems like Linear B writing. Yet Lefkandi yields imported goods from Cyprus, the Near East, and possibly Egypt, pointing to the survival of maritime exchange networks in some form. Even a minimal network would require navigational capabilities across open sea distances exceeding 100 kilometers, shipbuilding techniques capable of repeated voyages, and social coordination mechanisms to sustain exchange. Rather than complete collapse, the evidence suggests fragmentation into smaller decentralized systems, with Lefkandi functioning as a node within this reduced but persistent network. If such connectivity continued beyond the visible collapse of major civilizations, then the traditional concept of a total economic breakdown during the Greek Dark Age becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. The concentration of gold ornaments, imported ceramics, and high-value materials at Lefkandi indicates the presence of an elite class capable of controlling resources and organizing labor at a level inconsistent with models of societal regression. While post-collapse societies are generally expected to exhibit reduced hierarchy and dispersed wealth, Lefkandi demonstrates centralized authority, access to surplus beyond subsistence needs, and continuity in symbolic and ritual expression. Compared to other settlements across mainland Greece during the same period, many of which show smaller population sizes, limited artifact diversity, and simplified construction, Lefkandi emerges not merely as an anomaly, but as a direct contradiction of the expected trajectory of decline. By the 9th century BCE, Lefkandi enters a phase of decline and is eventually abandoned without clear evidence of violent destruction, large-scale fire, or catastrophic environmental change. There is no direct continuation into a larger urban center, and perhaps more significantly, no architectural lineage linking the Tumba structure to later Greek temple forms, which adopt entirely different proportions and construction systems. The knowledge embedded in the design of the Haroun does not visibly transfer into subsequent architectural traditions. It appears within the archaeological record, persists for a limited period, and then vanishes without continuity. What do you think Lefkandi really represents? A rare anomaly in a broken world, or a surviving fragment of a hidden network we have yet to fully understand? Cabezo Redondo is not supposed to function the way it does. Located near modern Villena in southeastern Spain, this hilltop settlement dates to approximately 2000 to 1200 BCE. Within the Iberian Bronze Age, a period typically defined by small, loosely organized communities still experimenting with early forms of social complexity. Yet from the moment it is examined in detail, Cabezo Redondo resists that classification. It appears structured, controlled, and internally coordinated at a level that does not align with its time. Excavations carried out throughout the 20th century revealed a densely compressed settlement built across a naturally defensive elevation. The architectural layout is not random. Houses are tightly interlocked, sharing walls and minimizing unused space. Movement is channeled through narrow, deliberate pathways. This is not organic expansion. It resembles a system under constraint, as if spatial efficiency was not a byproduct, but a governing principle. Compared to other Iberian Bronze Age sites, particularly the dispersed rural settlements across central Spain, Cabezo Redondo behaves less like a village and more like an early compact urban mechanism. The anomaly intensifies when storage systems are considered. Archaeologists uncovered numerous silos and embedded storage pits integrated directly into domestic structures. Their combined capacity exceeds what would be expected for a subsistence-level population. Estimates indicate volumes sufficient either to sustain a significantly larger population than the settlement likely contained, or to maintain reserves far beyond seasonal necessity. This is not casual surplus. It implies intentional accumulation, long-term planning, and controlled distribution, which leads to the central problem: control without visibility. No palatial structures have been identified. There are no monumental administrative buildings, no centralized complexes that would indicate a ruling authority in material form. In contemporaneous sites such as Mycenae, we observe massive fortifications, formalized elite spaces, and unmistakable symbols of hierarchy. Cabezo Redondo presents none of these. And yet, the internal logic of the settlement suggests that hierarchy must have existed. Certain dwellings are larger and more complex, implying social differentiation. Storage appears unevenly distributed, implying selective access. The system operates like a managed economy, but without exposing the mechanism that manages it. Material culture reinforces the contradiction. The inhabitants clearly possessed bronze working capabilities, a technology dependent on both technical knowledge and access to trade networks for copper and tin. While parts of Iberia provide certain metal resources, the full metallurgical process requires connections beyond the immediate environment. This suggests participation in regional or even long-distance exchange systems. However, the scale of coordination implied by the settlement's organization exceeds what is typically supported by evidence of such networks in this region during the same period. Once again, the internal complexity of the system outpaces its external context. Nearby, another discovery complicates the picture further: the Velena treasure. This hoard, consisting of nearly 10 kilograms of gold along with silver and early iron objects, is one of the most significant Bronze Age finds in Western Europe. The craftsmanship is precise. The quantity is extraordinary. Yet within Cabezo Redondo itself, there is no equivalent display of wealth, no elite tombs filled with gold, no ceremonial architecture designed to exhibit power. The wealth exists, but it is disconnected from visibility. This creates a second layer of contradiction. In most early complex societies, wealth is transformed into display. It legitimizes authority, reinforces hierarchy, and communicates dominance across social layers. At Cabezo Redondo, wealth appears to have been removed from this equation. It is accumulated, but not exhibited, controlled, but not declared. The system does not signal power in the ways we expect. Architecturally, the settlement reflects a form of intelligence that is subtle but effective. Construction relies on stone and mud brick, materials used with an efficiency that maximizes thermal regulation and structural stability. The design integrates seamlessly with the terrain, reducing the need for large-scale defensive construction while maintaining security. This is not technological limitation, it is optimization. Yet the tools recovered from the site do not fully explain the precision of spatial organization achieved. The knowledge existed, the process remains partially obscured. Population estimates suggest a few hundred inhabitants at peak occupation. Statistically, this is significant. Anthropological models indicate that such a population size typically does not require nor sustain the level of organizational complexity observed here without either strong centralized authority or a much larger demographic base. Cabezo Redondo fits neither model cleanly. It is too small to demand such coordination, yet too coordinated to arise spontaneously. Time introduces the final disruption. The settlement remained active for several centuries. There is no clear evidence of catastrophic destruction, no widespread burn layers, no mass graves indicative of conflict, no abrupt abandonment horizon. Instead, occupation appears to diminish gradually. Activity declines, structural coherence weakens, and eventually the system ceases to exist. Not destroyed, not conquered, simply discontinued. This pattern diverges from better documented collapses. Across the eastern Mediterranean, late Bronze Age sites frequently display clear destruction layers associated with systemic collapse around 1200 BCE. Cabezo Redondo does not conform to this pattern. Its disappearance appears internal, slow, and unforced. What remains is not a typical settlement, but a functional anomaly, a community that demonstrates controlled resource management, spatial precision, and social differentiation without the visible frameworks that usually support such features. It behaves like a system governed by principles that are only partially preserved in the archaeological record. One interpretation suggests that Cabezo Redondo represents an early form of centralized economic control authority, embedded not in monuments, but in access to storage and distribution. Another proposes that social cohesion and shared cultural norms replace the need for overt displays of power, creating a stable equilibrium that left minimal physical evidence. Both interpretations attempt to reconcile the data. Neither fully resolves it. A more unsettling possibility remains. Cabezo Redondo may represent a configuration of human organization that does not align with established models of social evolution. A system that functioned efficiently within its own constraints, but did not expand, replicate, or leave a clear developmental legacy. Not an early step toward later civilizations, but a parallel formation, one that emerged, stabilized, and then ended without continuation. Because the central issue is not the absence of information, it is the behavior of the information we possess. The settlement is too organized for its scale, too controlled for its visibility, and too coherent for its historical position. It does not follow the expected trajectory of complexity. Cabezo Redondo does not revise history. It exposes the possibility that history itself is incomplete. Humans learn to build cities gradually. At least, that is what the historical model suggests. Villages became towns, towns became fortified centers, and only after thousands of years did complex urban planning emerge. But at Yunit site, this sequence appears to collapse. Buried beneath layers of earth in southern Bulgaria lies a settlement dated to approximately the 6th millennium BCE, yet it displays structural decisions that resemble far later civilizations. Defensive walls several meters thick, repeated reconstruction phases, and material stability across millennia, all appearing at a time when most of Europe had not yet developed large-scale architecture. The anomaly is not that Yunit site exists. The anomaly is that it exists too early, too complete, and too stable. The site of Yunit site was first identified in the 20th century during systematic archaeological surveys of the Thracian plain. Excavations intensified in the 1970s and continued into the 21st century, revealing a tell settlement, a mound formed by continuous human occupation over thousands of years. Stratigraphic analysis demonstrated that the deepest layers date back more than 7,000 years, placing Yunit site among the earliest large-scale settlements in Europe. Each excavation phase revealed something unexpected. Beneath later Bronze Age and Iron Age layers, archaeologists uncovered a Chalcolithic settlement with fortifications, including walls estimated at 3 to 4 meters thick. Radiocarbon dating confirmed their antiquity, aligning them with a period when metallurgy was minimal and construction tools were still predominantly stone-based. Yet the structural logic of these walls suggested planning, reinforcement, and long-term durability. This is where Yunit site becomes genuinely difficult to explain. The environmental conditions of the region are not favorable for long-term preservation of primitive materials. The Thracian plain experiences seasonal temperature variation exceeding 30 degrees Celsius, along with periods of heavy rainfall and fluctuating humidity. The soil composition is largely alluvial, rich but structurally unstable, prone to erosion and water infiltration. Under such conditions, construction based on rammed earth, timber, and unprocessed stone should degrade rapidly, often within decades or, at most, a few centuries. And yet, at Yunit site, structural layers have persisted for millennia. Microscopic analysis of soil samples taken from the fortification walls shows a level of compaction that suggests intentional density control, not random accumulation. Grain alignment and compression patterns indicate repeated mechanical action, implying that builders deliberately optimize the internal structure of the material. The layering pattern, alternating compacted earth with inclusions of stone and organic material, resembles early forms of composite engineering. In modern terms, such layering can improve load distribution, reduce stress concentration, and increase resistance to cracking. Similar in principle to how reinforced concrete distributes internal forces. But here lies the paradox. There is no evidence that the builders possessed theoretical knowledge of material science. There are no written records, no instruments capable of measuring pressure or density, and no established tradition of large-scale engineering at that time in Europe. The knowledge appears functional, precise, and effective, yet completely undocumented. Comparisons make the anomaly clearer. Rammed earth structures from later historical periods, including fortifications of the Han Dynasty or medieval European earthworks, often show significant degradation after centuries. Many require restoration, reinforcement, or collapse entirely under prolonged environmental stress. Even when constructed with more advanced tools and organized labor, their longevity is limited by environmental exposure. Yet, Yunit site's core structures remain stable enough to be identified thousands of years later, preserving both form and stratigraphic clarity. Even more puzzling are traces of thermal alteration. Some sections of the walls show signs of exposure to high temperatures, likely from destructive fires, yet instead of disintegrating, certain layers appear to have hardened, increasing their resistance. This effect resembles modern processes where controlled heating can alter the microstructure of clay, enhancing its compressive strength and durability. However, there is no clear evidence that such processes were intentionally applied, raising the possibility that either accidental conditions produced beneficial outcomes or that the builders possessed empirical knowledge of heat-based material transformation. What emerges is a possibility that challenges conventional narratives. The builders of Yunit site may have developed a form of empirical engineering, a system based not on formal theory but on iterative experimentation, observation, and refinement. Through repeated cycles of construction and reconstruction, they may have discovered methods of material stabilization that achieved results comparable to far later technologies. This would imply a feedback loop of knowledge accumulation operating without written transmission, a fragile system that could easily disappear if disrupted. But this leads to a deeper and more unsettling question. If such knowledge existed and proved effective, why does it not appear elsewhere in a continuous developmental chain? Why is it not clearly replicated, expanded, or transmitted into later European construction traditions? The walls of Yunit site are not merely thick, they are strategically constructed. Their layout suggests an understanding of defense, including layered barriers, controlled access points, and possibly elevated or reinforced sections designed to absorb or deflect force. This implies anticipation of organized conflict, not random threat. However, Large-scale warfare in Europe during the Chalcolithic period is not well documented. Most settlements from this era show minimal defensive architecture, often consisting of simple boundaries or natural protection rather than engineered fortifications. By contrast, Yunit site appears to have been designed with threat mitigation in mind, as if its builders expected sustained external pressure or repeated confrontation. Evidence of destruction layers supports this interpretation. Burn patterns, collapsed wall segments, and directional debris distribution indicate that the settlement may have experienced violent attacks, possibly multiple times. The consistency of these patterns suggests organized events rather than isolated incidents. Reconstruction phases that follow show resilience and continuity, implying that the inhabitants rebuilt using similar structural logic, preserving their methods across generations. This introduces another anomaly. A fortified urban structure appears to exist before the widespread emergence of organized warfare in the region, suggesting either that conflict developed earlier than currently understood, or that Yunit site occupied a unique position within a network of interactions that remains largely invisible in the archaeological record. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Yunit site is not its sophistication, but its isolation in time. Archaeological sequences typically show gradual evolution. Techniques improve, spread, and diversify across regions. Innovations are adopted, modified, and integrated into broader cultural systems. Yet Yunit site does not clearly connect to a wider network of similar sites, exhibiting the same level of material and structural optimization. Its engineering features do not appear to propagate into later European construction traditions in any direct or traceable way. It is as if a system of knowledge briefly emerged, reached a functional peak, and then vanished. There are no direct descendants, no incremental improvements that can be clearly linked, no written transmission preserving the principles behind its construction methods. The continuity that defines most technological progress appears to be missing. In modern scientific terms, this resembles a discontinuous innovation event, a localized breakthrough that fails to integrate into a wider technological ecosystem. Such events are rare but documented in complex systems, where knowledge can emerge under specific conditions and disappear if those conditions are not maintained. However, their presence in deep prehistory complicates the linear model of human progress, suggesting that development may not always follow a predictable or cumulative path. What do you think happened at Yunit site? Was this the result of lost knowledge, experimental engineering, or something else entirely? The story of construction is supposed to be gradual, unstable shelters, becoming structured villages, crude walls evolving into engineered cities, with every stage leaving behind traces of error, transition, and refinement. But Almoloya challenges that entire narrative. Perched on a dry hilltop in southeastern Spain, this Bronze Age settlement, dated roughly between 200 and 1550 BCE and attributed to the El Argar culture, presents something deeply unsettling. A system that appears already complete, not evolving, not experimenting, just functioning, as if the process that should have led to it had already happened somewhere else. La Almoloya was systematically excavated in the early 21st century by researchers from the Autonomous University of Barcelona, building on earlier surveys of Argaric hilltop settlements, and what initially appeared to be another fortified Bronze Age site quickly distinguished itself through an unusual level of structural clarity that did not match the expected developmental patterns of the time. Stratigraphic analysis revealed occupation layers consistent with mid-2nd millennium BCE habitation, yet the architectural coherence across those layers suggested minimal redesign or adaptation over centuries. which is highly atypical when compared to other settlements of similar age. Radiocarbon dating of organic remains confirmed a relatively narrow occupation window, approximately 6 to 7 centuries, yet within that period, the site exhibits a level of planning more commonly associated with later, more complex societies, and when compared to contemporaneous settlements across Iberia, many of which display irregular growth, spatial improvisation, and continuous architectural adjustment, La Almoloya instead appears intentionally designed from its earliest phase, with no clear transitional forms and no primitive prototypes beneath the final structures, as if the first version we see is already the final version. The most striking structure uncovered at La Almoloya is a large rectangular hall, often interpreted as an early form of political or assembly space, measuring approximately 70 square meters and containing stone benches lining the walls that could seat around 50 individuals in a structured and highly organized arrangement. And this is precisely where the anomaly begins to take shape. In Mesopotamia during the same period, political authority was typically embedded within temple complexes or palace structures that were hierarchical and often inaccessible to collective participation, while in ancient Egypt, centralized power expressed itself through monumental architecture, designed to reinforce authority rather than facilitate discussion. Yet here, in a relatively small settlement in Iberia, there exists a space that appears optimized for visibility, acoustics, and structured gathering in a way that implies coordinated interaction rather than passive observation. The geometry is deliberate, with a central open area functioning as a focal point and a seating arrangement that ensures all participants face inward, suggesting an understanding of spatial dynamics linked to governance or at least organized decision-making. And more importantly, there is no evidence of earlier versions of this space, no smaller or less refined hall, no irregular gathering area that gradually evolved into this design, meaning it appears fully conceptualized from its inception, not as the result of trial and error, but as a complete idea executed immediately. The true mystery of La Almoloya lies not in its layout, but in the behavior of its materials, because the site's architecture relies heavily on rammed earth, compacted clay, and natural gypsum-based plasters, materials that, under typical environmental conditions, are expected to degrade relatively quickly, especially in a region like southeastern Spain where the climate is semi-arid, characterized by strong temperature fluctuations between day and night, and periodic rainfall that accelerates cracking, erosion, and long-term structural failure in earthen construction. And yet, despite these conditions, sections of flooring and wall bases at La Almoloya remain remarkably intact after more than 3,500 years, preserving not only their structure, but also their geometry to a degree that is difficult to explain through conventional expectations of Bronze Age construction. Micromorphological studies of the floor layers reveal dense compaction and carefully layered construction sequences, with some surfaces exhibiting hardness levels approaching that of weak concrete, which implies repeated compression techniques or precise moisture control during the building process, both of which require a level of material understanding that is not clearly documented for this period. In experimental archaeology, attempts to replicate similar density and durability using reconstructed Bronze Age methods have produced inconsistent results, often failing to achieve the same level of cohesion and long-term stability observed at the site, when compared to contemporaneous adobe structures in the Near East, which were built using broadly similar base materials, but have often degraded into indistinct sedimentary layers over time. Losing their original shape and structural definition, La Almoloya stands out as an exception rather than a rule, and even in environments more favorable to preservation, maintaining flat, Continuous surfaces over millennia without stone reinforcement is extremely rare. At La Almoloya, however, floor planes remain level across measurable spans, wall junctions retain structural coherence, and the adhesion between material layers shows minimal separation, suggesting that the builders were not simply using available materials, but controlling them with a level of precision that appears disproportionate to the technological framework we associate with the Bronze Age. This leads to a critical question. Were these builders intuitively mastering principles of soil mechanics at a level that modern reconstruction still struggles to replicate? Or were they applying a standardized construction method that has not survived elsewhere in the archaeological record with the same clarity? The paradox is not that the materials themselves are advanced, but that their performance exceeds expectations without any visible evidence of the developmental process that would normally produce such results. Directly beneath the assembly hall, archaeologists uncovered a burial that introduces an additional layer of complexity to the site's interpretation, where inside, a large ceramic vessel were the remains of two individuals, a man and a woman, accompanied by an extraordinary collection of silver artifacts, including a finely crafted diadem that immediately drew attention due to both its craftsmanship and symbolic implications. The significance of this burial lies not only in the wealth it represents, but in how that wealth is distributed, because the diadem, a clear marker of status and authority, was associated with the woman rather than the man, challenging long-standing assumptions about gendered power structures in Bronze Age Europe, where authority is typically interpreted as male-dominated. Chemical analysis of the silver indicates a high level of purity and suggests controlled extraction and distribution networks within the Argaric culture, pointing to an organized economic system capable of managing valuable resources with precision. Furthermore, the placement of the burial directly beneath the central political space suggests a deliberate integration of authority, ancestry, and architecture. Unlike many other ancient societies where elite burials are spatially separated into tombs, necropolises, or designated sacred zones, because here, power is not set apart from daily function, but embedded within it, structurally and symbolically at the same time, making the building itself not just a place of gathering, but a physical manifestation of authority that rests quite literally on the individuals buried beneath it. The layout of La Almoloya reveals a level of planning rarely seen in settlements of the same period, with terracing clearly separating residential and functional zones, indicating intentional design rather than organic growth. Defensive positioning relies on elevation and visibility, prioritizing efficiency over monumental construction. However, the most striking feature is the absence of developmental layers. There are no simpler structures beneath more complex ones, as typically found in archaeological sites. From its earliest phase, the settlement already displays a complete spatial organization, suggesting it did not gradually evolve but appeared in an almost finished state. This leads to two possibilities. Either the knowledge was developed elsewhere and introduced here, or the transition occurred so rapidly that it left little trace, both of which challenge the conventional model of gradual societal evolution. If a society can build something this complete without leaving behind any trace of how it evolved, do you think we are missing part of human history or misunderstanding it entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. In the early 20th century, along the rugged Atlantic coast of Galicia, local fishermen and villagers had long known of a strange cluster of stone ruins standing on a narrow rocky peninsula. But it was not until systematic archaeological attention in the 1930s, later expanded in the 1970s and early 21st century, that Castro de Baroña began to reveal its true nature, as what initially appeared to be a simple coastal ruin was identified as an Iron Age hill fort belonging to the broader Castro culture, dating roughly from the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE. From the beginning, the site presented a contradiction because most hill forts in the region are located inland, strategically positioned to oversee fertile valleys or trade routes, while Baroña instead occupies a peninsula of approximately 2.5 hectares, nearly cut off from the mainland and exposed directly to Atlantic winds that can exceed 100 kilometers per hour during storms. And early surveys mapping between 20 and 30 circular structures enclosed within 2 defensive walls only deepened the central question: why build here? Excavations conducted across multiple campaigns uncovered a sequence of occupation that appeared stable rather than transitional, and unlike early settlements that typically show gradual development from crude to refined construction, Baroña's structures appear already optimized from the earliest layers, with archaeologists identifying circular stone dwellings ranging from 3 to 5 meters in diameter, constructed using dry stone techniques without mortar, yet exhibiting remarkable stability, along with double defensive walls featuring narrow, controlled entry points and an internal organization suggesting a planned layout rather than organic growth. Ceramic fragments indicate largely local production, with hints of contact with Roman trade networks, while carbon dating places peak occupation between roughly 100 BCE and 100 CE, and although animal remains are sparse, consisting mainly of shellfish, fish bones, and limited terrestrial fauna, the more striking observation lies in what is absent, as there is no clear evidence of large-scale agriculture, no irrigation systems, no wells of significant depth, and no storage facilities capable of sustaining a large population through seasonal shortages, meaning that with each excavation season adding detail, the overall mystery only deepens. The architecture of Castro de Baroña reflects a paradox of simplicity and precision, where circular houses, while typical of the Castro culture, are arranged in a way that suggests a level of environmental adaptation beyond what is commonly attributed to Iron Age communities, as the walls, often exceeding 0.5 meter in thickness, provide thermal mass against fluctuating coastal temperatures, while the circular form minimizes wind resistance and reduces structural stress during Atlantic storms. And many dwellings are partially embedded into the terrain to lower exposure to direct wind impact. Comparative analysis with inland castros reveals notable differences in orientation and clustering, since at Baroña buildings are arranged in tight formations that create micro-barriers disrupting airflow, a principle resembling aerodynamic strategies seen in modern architecture designed for extreme climates. And even the defensive walls raise further questions, because their strongest sections face the ocean rather than the land, suggesting that beyond protection from human threats, they may have functioned to mitigate wave force and wind pressure, indicating that this was not merely a settlement, but a system engineered to resist a hostile environment. This is where the logic begins to break, because a settlement of this size estimated to support between 100 and 200 inhabitants would require a stable and sufficient food supply, and based on average caloric needs, such a population would require tens of thousands of kilocalories per day, amounting to several tons of food resources annually. Yet Baroña offers no clear mechanism to support this scale of subsistence. Marine exploitation remains the most widely accepted explanation, given that the surrounding Atlantic waters are rich in biodiversity including fish, mollusks, and crustaceans, and shell middens found at the site confirm that seafood formed part of the diet. But marine resources alone present critical limitations. As seasonal variability affects availability, storm conditions can restrict access to the sea for extended periods, and preservation challenges limit long-term storage without advanced techniques, and when compared to other coastal settlements with similar reliance on marine resources, which typically show evidence of drying racks, salting installations, or large storage pits, Baroña notably lacks such infrastructure. Terrestrial resources are equally problematic, since the peninsula itself offers almost no arable land, and inland farming would require consistent transport across a narrow, exposed land bridge, for which no substantial infrastructure has been identified. While trade remains a possibility given Roman influence in the region during the 1st century BCE and CE, and the presence of ceramic evidence suggesting some level of exchange, yet the scale of such trade remains unclear, with no indication of port facilities or docking systems capable of sustaining high-volume supply, leading to a more unsettling possibility that we may be missing an entire layer of subsistence strategy, perhaps involving a now-vanished preservation technique adapted to high-salinity environments, seasonal occupation patterns that reduced continuous demand, or a hybrid economy combining small-scale agriculture, marine harvesting, and trade in ways not yet fully understood. And what makes Baroña unique is not simply the absence of answers, but the fact that every conventional explanation appears insufficient. By the 1st century CE, the site was abandoned without any clear signs of violent destruction, as there are no burn layers, no mass graves, no evidence of siege or rapid evacuation, and the structures remain largely intact as if simply left behind, a timeline that coincides with the consolidation of Roman control in the Iberian Peninsula under the expanding influence of the Roman Empire, during which many indigenous settlements were reorganized, relocated, or absorbed into new administrative systems. Yet even this broader historical context does not fully explain Baroña, because other castros typically show gradual integration through architectural modifications, Roman goods, and hybrid cultural layers, whereas Baroña does not display a clear transition, but instead appears to end cleanly and abruptly. When viewed in isolation, Castro de Baroña is unusual, but when compared to broader archaeological patterns it becomes something more profound, since most human settlements follow a predictable trajectory involving access to fresh water, proximity to arable land, gradual technological development, and increasing complexity over time. Yet Baroña violates each of these principles by appearing in a hostile location already structurally optimized, sustaining itself through unknown means, and disappearing without any trace of decline, forming a pattern of sudden emergence, stability, and disappearance that resembles anomalies found in other ancient sites, but rarely with such clarity. What do you think sustained life at Castro de Baroña? Leave your theory in the comments below. Motilla del Azuer was first systematically excavated in the 1970s in the La Mancha plain of central Spain. Beneath what appeared to be a low circular mound, archaeologists uncovered a multi-layered fortified structure dating to approximately 2,200–1,500 BCE during the early to Middle Bronze Age. What initially looked like a defensive outpost soon revealed something far more complex, a deep, engineered well at its core, immediately distinguishing it from typical Bronze Age settlements and raising questions about its true purpose from the very beginning. Most early complex societies formed in direct relationship with predictable water sources, where environmental stability allowed agriculture and urban planning to develop gradually over time. The cities of Mohenjo-Daro and relied on river systems such as the Indus River and Euphrates River, where seasonal flooding could be anticipated, controlled, and eventually engineered into irrigation networks. Motilla del Azuer violates this entire model. Located in a semi-arid plateau with no permanent rivers nearby, The site sits in a region where annual rainfall today averages only 300–400 millimeters, and paleoclimate reconstructions indicate that during the 4.2 kiloyear climate event, a global drought phase beginning around 2200 BCE, conditions were even more severe, contributing to societal stress and collapse across regions from Mesopotamia to Egypt. Yet here, instead of abandonment or migration, we see deliberate construction. Rather than moving toward water as nearly every other known civilization did, the inhabitants of Motilla engineered access to it beneath their feet, suggesting a radically different survival strategy that depended not on geography, but on controlled subsurface resources. At the center of the structure lies a well exceeding 16 meters in depth, making it one of the earliest known deep wells in the Iberian Peninsula and one of the most technically demanding features of the entire site. Excavations reveal carefully arranged stone linings that stabilize the shaft and prevent collapse under shifting soil pressures, indicating a level of structural planning far beyond what is typically attributed to early Bronze Age communities in Western Europe. The difficulty is not simply the act of digging, but the precision required to succeed. To access groundwater effectively, ancient builders would have needed to identify a viable aquifer without geological instruments, estimate depth with minimal error, maintain vertical alignment during excavation, and reinforce the shaft in a way that would ensure long-term stability under variable environmental conditions. Modern hydrogeology relies on drilling surveys, resistivity mapping, and stratigraphic analysis to achieve these outcomes, none of which were available at the time. Even more striking is the fact that this was not an isolated success. Multiple motillas across the La Mancha region contain similar wells, implying the existence of a repeatable and reliable method rather than accidental discovery. Statistically, repeatedly striking groundwater at functional depths without a consistent detection strategy would be highly improbable, suggesting that the builders possessed a form of environmental knowledge that has not been preserved in the archaeological record. Whether this knowledge was the result of accumulated empirical observation or a more structured system of understanding remains unresolved. At first glance, Motilla del Azuer presents itself as a defensive structure, characterized by concentric walls, narrow and controlled access corridors, and a central elevated tower that would typically function as a vantage point or last line of defense. However, a closer functional analysis reveals that the architecture is organized around a different priority entirely. The most protected and structurally reinforced element within the complex is not a military installation or storage facility, but the well itself. This inversion of expected defensive logic is significant. In other ancient systems, such as Petra, water infrastructure was integrated into the urban landscape through channels, reservoirs, and cisterns designed to collect and distribute seasonal rainfall, while in Hattusa, large-scale water storage systems were embedded within a broader administrative and defensive framework. In both examples, water remains accessible and distributed across the settlement. At Motilla, by contrast, water is centralized, enclosed, and heavily controlled, accessible only through the innermost layers of the structure. This suggests not only an advanced understanding of hydraulic necessity, but also a socio-political system in which access to water may have been regulated, possibly reflecting extreme scarcity conditions where groundwater became the most valuable and vulnerable resource. The construction of Motilla del Azuer relies primarily on locally sourced materials, including uncut or roughly shaped stone and compacted earth applied through rammed earth techniques, with minimal evidence of advanced binding agents or reinforcement technologies. Under typical conditions, such materials are highly susceptible to environmental stressors, including moisture variation, thermal expansion, erosion, and structural fatigue over time. Despite this, significant portions of the structure have remained stable for more than 3,000 years, an outcome that challenges conventional expectations in materials science. Particularly notable is the integrity of the internal walls near the well shaft, where fluctuations in humidity would have been most pronounced. These walls exhibit a degree of cohesion and durability that implies careful selection and preparation of soil composition, precise layering methods to distribute mechanical stress, and potentially even timing of construction phases to align with optimal environmental conditions for curing and stabilization. Such performance characteristics are typically associated with long-term iterative experimentation and gradual refinement. Yet the archaeological record surrounding the Mohyla culture does not display a clear sequence of developmental stages or failed attempts leading to this level of engineering efficiency. Instead, the structure appears to embody a mature understanding of material behavior from its earliest phases. Motilla del Azuer is part of a broader pattern rather than an isolated anomaly. More than 30 motillas have been identified across the La Mancha region, each sharing core architectural features such as central wells, concentric fortifications, and strategic placement within the landscape. When analysed spatially, these sites form a loosely distributed network, often positioned at intervals that would allow communication or travel between them within a matter of hours. This distribution suggests the possibility of coordinated planning, shared technical knowledge, or at the very least, a cultural framework in which similar solutions to environmental challenges were independently but consistently implemented. The existence of such a network implies a level of regional organization that goes beyond simple village-level construction. However, unlike the centralized states of Mesopotamia or Egypt, there is no clear evidence of administrative hierarchy, no written documentation, and no monumental inscriptions that would indicate the presence of governing institutions overseeing this system. What emerges instead is a decentralized, yet highly consistent infrastructure, operating with a level of technical coherence that is difficult to reconcile with the absence of visible coordination mechanisms. By approximately 1500 BCE, the Mohyla system was abandoned, marking the end of a distinctive and technologically sophisticated phase in the region's prehistory. The nature of this abandonment remains unclear. There is no widespread evidence of violent destruction, no signs of catastrophic collapse, and no clear indicators of sudden external disruption. Instead, the archaeological evidence suggests a gradual process of desertion. Several explanations have been proposed, including climatic recovery that may have reduced dependence on deep groundwater extraction, overuse of aquifers leading to declining water tables, or broader social and demographic transformations that altered settlement patterns. However, none of these hypotheses fully account for the disappearance of a system that appears to have been both effective and resilient under extreme environmental conditions. Unlike many ancient technologies that evolve into more advanced or adapted forms, the Mohyla system does not demonstrate a clear trajectory of development or integration into later cultures. It emerges, functions at a high level of efficiency, and then ceases without a direct successor, leaving behind a gap in the historical narrative. What do you think? Was this the result of lost empirical knowledge, or evidence of a level of environmental engineering we still don't fully understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Discovery did not begin with a grand expedition, but with construction. In the late 20th century, urban expansion in the city of Jaén, southern Spain, exposed an unexpected pattern beneath the soil arcs of trenches, fragments of circular ditches, and repeated curvatures that did not align with any known medieval or Roman layout. Rescue excavations in the 1990s gradually revealed what satellite imagery would later confirm: a vast prehistoric complex composed of multiple concentric rings, extending across more than 100 hectares. Radiocarbon dating placed its primary occupation between roughly 3000 and 2500 BCE, positioning it firmly within the Copper Age. What initially appeared to be scattered features turned out to be part of a unified design, one that, even today, resists simple explanation. The first layer of mystery emerges from geometry. Marroquies Bajos is not irregular, not organic, and not the result of slow, chaotic growth. It is structured. Archaeological mapping has identified at least 5 major concentric ditches, each separated by relatively consistent distances. In some sectors, spacing between rings varies by only a few meters across spans of several hundred meters, an error margin that suggests intentional measurement rather than approximation. For comparison, early Neolithic settlements across Europe, such as those associated with the linear band ceramic culture, typically display loosely organized layouts, expanding outward without strict geometric control. Even later fortified enclosures like causewayed camps in Britain show irregular interruptions rather than continuous symmetry. Marroquies Bajos, by contrast, approaches the logic of planned radial design, something more commonly associated with much later urban experiments. This raises a fundamental technical question. How was such precision achieved? At a scale exceeding 1 kilometer in diameter, maintaining circular symmetry requires more than visual estimation. Modern reconstructions suggest that even a small angular deviation at the center would produce significant displacement at the perimeter. Without metal surveying instruments, standardized units, or written mathematical systems, the builders would have needed alternative methods, possibly rope-based measurement systems, fixed Marquesi points, or repeated geometric iteration. Yet no intermediate stages, no trial layouts, no partial corrections have been identified. The system appears as if executed with prior conceptual clarity. If geometry defines the form, water defines the function, or at least complicates it. The concentric ditches are not merely empty boundaries. Sediment analysis indicates periodic water retention, with layers of silt suggesting controlled flooding events. Some sections display gradients that would allow directional flow, implying that water was not only present but managed. This introduces a level of hydraulic awareness that seems disproportionate to what is known about Copper Age communities in the Iberian Peninsula. In regions such as Mesopotamia, large-scale irrigation systems emerge in tandem with urbanization and agricultural intensification. Here, however, the scale of water management infrastructure appears to exceed the documented agricultural capacity of the settlement itself. Comparative estimates deepen the puzzle. To excavate even a single ditch of several meters width and depth, extending in a near-perfect circle over hundreds of meters, would require the removal of thousands of cubic meters of earth. Multiplied across multiple rings, the total labor investment reaches into the tens of thousands of man-hours. And yet, population estimates for the site based on dwelling remains suggest a community of perhaps a few thousand individuals at most. This implies either a highly organized labor system, seasonal workforce aggregation, or a longer construction timeline than currently assumed. But again, the archaeological record offers limited evidence for gradual accumulation. Instead, the structure reads as a coherent whole. Material behavior adds another layer of contradiction. The ditches and embankments were formed primarily from compacted earth, mixed with stones and organic inclusions. Under typical environmental conditions, seasonal rainfall, erosion, soil instability, such features should degrade rapidly, losing definition within centuries. However, portions of Marroquies Bajos have retained identifiable stratification for over 4 millennia. Micromorphological studies of soil samples indicate deliberate compaction techniques, possibly involving moisture control during construction. This suggests that the builders possessed empirical knowledge of soil mechanics, how to increase density, reduce permeability, and stabilize structure over time. Such knowledge does not require formal science, but it does require repeated observation and transmission. Yet, as with other aspects of the site, there is little evidence of earlier, simpler precedents evolving into this level of execution. Function remains the most elusive variable. A defensive interpretation struggles under scrutiny. While ditches can serve as barriers, the openness of the system, the lack of consistent ramparts, and the sheer scale of enclosure reduce its efficiency as a fortification. A ceremonial interpretation introduces different challenges. The spatial organization is vast, far exceeding what is typically required for ritual gatherings, and lacks clear focal monuments such as temples or altars at the center. An agricultural model, centered on water control, must account for the mismatch between infrastructure scale and crop evidence. Each hypothesis explains part of the system, but none resolves it entirely. There is also the question of temporal behavior. Stratigraphic analysis indicates phases of use, modification, and eventual abandonment. However, the transition does not follow a clear pattern of decline. There is no widespread destruction layer, no consistent signs of conflict, and no abrupt environmental shift recorded in local paleoclimatic data that would fully justify abandonment. Instead, activity appears to diminish, features are gradually filled or repurposed, and the system dissolves into the landscape. In archaeological terms, this is not an ending marked by catastrophe, but by disengagement. When placed within a broader Eurasian context, Marroquies Bajos becomes even more difficult to classify. Circular enclosures exist elsewhere, Neolithic rondels in Central Europe, for instance, but these are typically smaller, simpler, and more clearly ritual in function. Large-scale hydraulic systems appear in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, but they are embedded within literate, state-level societies. Here, in southern Iberia, a complex emerges that seems to borrow elements from both categories, geometry and water management, without fully belonging to either. One interpretation is that Marroquies Bajos represents a peak of technical and organizational capability under conditions we do not yet understand. Another is that it reflects a lost knowledge system, or simply a longer developmental process that remains hidden from the archaeological record. Yet the anomaly remains. The site shows coordinated planning, controlled execution, and environmental adaptation at a scale that exceeds its context. It does not look like a gradual experiment, it looks complete. And that distinction matters, because if it was built as a finished idea, the real question is no longer how it was constructed, but where that idea came from. Fields in southern Portugal conceal a structure that cannot be understood from the ground. Only from above does it reveal itself a vast system of concentric circles, arcs, and alignments stretching across hundreds of meters. At Perdigões archaeological complex, geometry was not drawn on parchment or carved into stone. It was carved directly into the earth itself. Built between roughly 3,400 and 2,000 BCE, this site predates many classical civilizations, and yet it exhibits a level of spatial planning, astronomical awareness, and structural consistency that feels strangely out of place, not impossible, but unexpectedly advanced for its time. The deeper researchers investigate, the clearer the pattern becomes. This was not random construction, but something intentional, repeated, and measured. Aligned with a sky, its builders had no known instruments to fully map. Unlike monumental ruins that dominate the landscape, Perdigões remained hidden for millennia, its true form invisible from ground level. It was only in the late 20th century, through aerial photography and geophysical techniques such as magnetometry, that its full scale began to emerge. From the ground, the site appears as faint soil variations and shallow depressions, but from above it resolves into more than a dozen concentric enclosures, some exceeding 300 meters in diameter. Excavations carried out by Portuguese archaeological teams revealed not a single structure, but a multi-phase complex, continuously modified over nearly 2,000 years. And yet, despite this extended timeline of development, the geometry did not degrade. It remained consistent, as if guided by a persistent underlying plan. Perdigões is fundamentally a system of rings, multiple ditches arranged concentrically to form a layered circular design, expanding outward. These are not rough approximations. Their curvature is controlled, continuous, and sustained across large distances. Constructing even a single circle of 100 meters with primitive tools requires maintaining a constant radius, where even small deviations compound into visible distortion. Over several hundred meters, such errors should become obvious unless corrected by precise measurement systems. Yet during the late Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods, there is no evidence of standardized surveying instruments, written geometric systems, or large-scale mapping methods. A commonly proposed explanation involves the use of stakes and ropes, but such techniques become increasingly unreliable as scale increases and terrain introduces irregularities. Despite these limitations, the circles at Perdigões close with minimal distortion, and the arcs align with remarkable consistency. For comparison, sites like Stonehenge, often cited for their precision, operate on a smaller scale and with simpler layouts, whereas Perdigões represents a multi-layered system extended across generations without losing its geometric coherence. This raises a critical question. How was geometric consistency maintained over centuries without a centralized design system? The ditches at Perdigões are far more than superficial markings. Some reach depths of 2 to 4 meters and display carefully controlled profiles, including V-shaped and trapezoidal cross-sections. Such forms suggest intentional engineering rather than casual excavation. Maintaining consistent angles and shapes across long curved paths requires coordination, planning, and sustained labor effort. Comparing, especially when considering the volume of earth involved, often amounting to thousands of cubic meters for a single large ditch. What makes this even more unusual is that these ditches do not conform to the natural landscape. Instead, they cut across it, preserving curvature rather than adapting to terrain. This indicates that geometry was prioritized over convenience, a decision that implies the layout itself held significance beyond simple function. Perhaps the most compelling mystery of Perdigões lies in how its structure relates to the sky. Several entrances and axes appear to align with astronomical phenomena, particularly the setting positions of the Moon during its major lunar standstill cycle, which occurs approximately every 18.6 years. During this cycle, the Moon reaches extreme Nakot along the horizon, extending farther north and south than at any other time. Detecting and understanding such a cycle requires observations spanning decades, recognition of repeating patterns that exceed a single human lifespan, and the ability to mark precise horizon positions. At Perdigões, certain ditches and passage-like openings correspond to these extreme lunar positions, suggesting intentional alignment rather than coincidence. Comparable phenomena exist at sites like Newgrange, where sunlight at the winter solstice illuminates a chamber, or Nabta Playa, where stone arrangements reflect solar orientations, but those examples typically focus on singular, highly controlled alignments. Perdigões differs in that astronomical orientation is distributed across an entire system rather than isolated in one structure. The challenge becomes clearer when considering the absence of tools. There is no evidence of angular measurement devices, permanent recording systems, or optical instruments. Yet aligning structures with lunar standstill positions requires tracking the moon's Tegai position over nearly 2 decades, identifying extreme necourt on the horizon, and translating those observations into fixed orientations on the ground. This process demands abstraction, the ability to convert a moving celestial reference into a stable terrestrial design. It also demands continuity, ensuring that knowledge is preserved and transmitted accurately across generations. However, no clear mechanism exists to explain how this information was stored or shared. This creates a paradox. Perdigões reflects long-term astronomical tracking within a culture that left no known system of long-term recording. Across the site, hundreds of pits have been discovered, circular excavations containing fragmented ceramics, animal remains, and occasionally human bones, often showing signs of burning or deliberate breakage. These features are typically interpreted as ritual deposits, but what stands out is their consistency. Many share similar dimensions, shapes, and spatial organization, suggesting repeated execution according to a shared set of rules. Such standardization implies a stable conceptual framework, one that persisted over time with minimal variation. In later societies, this level of uniformity is often associated with organized production systems or written instructions, yet at Perdigões there is no evidence of either. Instead, it appears that the community operated with a consistent internal model, applied generation after generation without significant deviation. Over centuries, Perdigões expanded and transformed, with new ditches added and older ones modified as activity shifted across the site. However, unlike many ancient construction traditions, there is little evidence of gradual refinement or experimentation. There is no clear progression from crude beginnings to sophisticated outcomes, no visible intercol from imprecision to precision. The geometric logic appears early and persists throughout the site's history. In contrast, civilizations such as ancient Egypt demonstrate a clear developmental trajectory from mastabas to step pyramids to fully realized pyramids, revealing an evolution of technique and understanding. At Perdigões, the system appears conceptually mature from its earliest phases, suggesting that the knowledge required to build it did not develop locally over time, but was already established when construction began. So what do you think, was this purely a ritual landscape, or something far more advanced that we still don't understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Towering walls are absent, monumental gates never existed, and obvious signs of engineering mastery seem nowhere to be found. Only a low mound of fractured sandstone rising quietly from the Ukrainian steppe. Yet hidden within this unassuming formation lies one of the most persistent contradictions in archaeology. Thousands of carvings, some dating back over 10,000 years, are preserved inside a structure that should not protect them, arranged in a system that should not exist, and maintained across time by cultures that never left behind a written explanation. Humanity has built pyramids, temples, and cities whose scale alone demands attention. But Kamyana Mohyla operates differently. It does not overwhelm, it confuses, because everything about it appears simple until you look closer. Unlike sites such as Göbekli Tepe, which shocked archaeologists with its sudden emergence in the 1990s, Kamyana Mohyla was never truly discovered in a single moment. It had always been there, visible as a low stone hill rising no more than 15 meters above the surrounding plain, yet its significance remained hidden. Systematic study began in the 19th century, when early explorers noticed unusual carvings inside narrow cavities formed by stacked sandstone slabs. Later excavations throughout the 20th century revealed over 3,000 petroglyphs distributed across dozens of chambers, while radiocarbon dating of associated organic material suggests usage spanning from the late Paleolithic over 12,000 years ago through the Bronze Age and into historical periods. This is where the anomaly begins. Unlike Lascaux Cave, where art is confined to a specific cultural horizon around 17,000 years ago, Kamyana Mohyla shows evidence of continuous reuse. As different cultures separated by millennia return to the same confined stone spaces and added to the same visual system without erasing it. Geologically, Kamyana Mohyla is classified as a natural sandstone outcrop formed by sedimentary deposition and erosion, where wind and water fractured the rock into large slabs that gradually collapsed into a mound. But inside this natural formation, chambers appear with consistent spatial proportions, often just large enough for human occupancy, while passageways connect spaces in ways that resemble intentional circulation paths, and some ceilings and walls align in planes that seem structurally stabilized beyond what loose sandstone stacking should allow. In comparison, natural cave systems such as Carlsbad caverns form through dissolution processes, producing smooth, continuous voids rather than stacked, layered chambers with discrete entry points. Here the geometry is different, raising a critical question. Was Kamyana Mohyla merely modified, or subtly engineered using the natural structure as a foundation? Across more than 3,000 recorded carvings, patterns begin to appear, including repeated motifs of animals such as bulls, horses, and deer, abstract symbols arranged in sequences rather than isolation, and overlapping layers that preserve earlier carvings while integrating new ones. In sites like Lascaux Cave, artistic layering often results in visual chaos over time, yet at Kamyana Mohyla the layering is selective, with later carvings frequently avoiding damage to earlier ones, suggesting a form of cultural memory or rule-based continuation. Some researchers have proposed that these carvings functioned not merely as art, but as a proto-symbolic communication system, a precursor to structured language or ritual encoding. Yet no decipherable grammar has been confirmed, raising a paradox. A system complex enough to persist, but too ambiguous to decode. Radiocarbon evidence and stylistic analysis indicate that the site was used across at least 6,000 to 8,000 years. For comparison, the entire span of recorded written history from early Sumerian cuneiform around 5,000 years ago to today is shorter than the active usage period of Kamyana Mohyla. And yet, unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, there is no surviving written language, no monumental architecture nearby, and no centralized civilization clearly tied to the site. Despite this, the internal logic of the carvings persists. How does a symbolic system remain stable over millennia without formal documentation? This is not just a cultural question, it is a systems problem. Sandstone is not a durable medium. On the Mohs hardness scale, it typically ranks between 6 and 7, yet its real weakness lies in its porosity, as water infiltration, freeze-thaw cycles, and wind erosion gradually degrade its surface. In exposed environments, detailed carvings in sandstone can lose definition within a few thousand years or even less under harsh conditions. The Ukrainian steppe presents exactly such conditions, with temperature fluctuations ranging from below -20 degrees Celsius in winter to above 30 degrees in summer, strong seasonal winds capable of transporting abrasive particles, and repeated moisture cycles that promote microfracturing. And yet, inside Kamyana Mohyla, fine lines and shallow engravings remain visible after more than 10 millennia. Interior surfaces show significantly reduced weathering compared to exterior rock faces, and certain chambers maintain stable microenvironments with lower humidity variation. In contrast, petroglyphs at exposed sites like Twyfelfontein, some only a few thousand years old, have experienced notable degradation despite being in arid climates. So why does Kamyana Mohyla preserve detail so effectively? One explanation is microclimate shielding, where stacked sandstone slabs create enclosed spaces that limit airflow, reduce ultraviolet exposure, and buffer temperature fluctuations. Yet this explanation is incomplete. Not all chambers preserve carvings equally. Some show clear degradation while others remain remarkably intact. And the difference often correlates with precise positioning within the structure, including angles of entry, depth from the surface, and orientation relative to prevailing winds. This suggests selective usage. Ancient users may have recognized which chambers offered optimal preservation conditions, effectively choosing locations based on environmental performance. If true, this implies empirical knowledge of material behavior, long-term observation across generations, and intentional placement of information in low-entropy zones. In modern terms, this resembles passive environmental engineering designing systems that stabilize themselves without active intervention. Yet here lies the deeper anomaly. There is no evidence of trial and error progression, as the system appears to function correctly from the earliest known phases. Some chambers exhibit orientations that loosely correspond to solar movement, particularly sunrise and sunset positions during seasonal transitions. While not as precise as megalithic sites like Stonehenge, the alignments are consistent enough to suggest non-random placement, raising the possibility that Kamyana Mohyla served dual purposes as both a repository of symbolic or ritual information and a spatially calibrated environment tied to cyclical time. If so, the carvings may not be static records but part of a dynamic interaction between space, light, and observation. So what do you think? Was Kamyana Mohyla a natural formation that humans adapted, or something more deliberate? Share your thoughts in the comments below.